The sharp, sickening thud of a fist meeting fragile skin reverberated through the sprawling mall, slicing through the usual clamor of chatter, footsteps, and rustling shopping bags. A burly police officer, his uniform crisp and imposing, had just driven his knuckles into the weathered face of an elderly black woman. The force of the blow sent her frail frame lurching backward, her thin legs wobbling as she fought to regain her balance. A collective gasp rose from the stunned crowd, the air thick with disbelief as shoppers halted mid-stride. Hands fumbled for phones, fingers trembling as they scrambled to record the horrifying spectacle unfolding before them. The officer, a man with a chiseled jawline and eyes that glinted with an icy detachment, stood over her like a predator savoring its prey. His fist remained clenched, knuckles white, as though poised to strike again. The woman, her gnarled hand pressed against her swelling cheek, staggered but refused to collapse. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts, betraying the frailty of her years, yet her gaze sharp, wet with pain, locked onto her assailant with a quiet, unyielding dignity. She didn't scream or crumple. Instead, she stood as a pillar of resilience, her trembling fingers the only sign of the storm raging within her. The mall, moments ago a buzzing hive of activity, now felt like a frozen to blow. Shoppers gawked, their faces a kaleidoscope of shock, fear, and indecision. "Someone call security," a voice cried out, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the suffocating silence, yet no one moved forward. The officer's glare swept over the onlookers, a silent challenge daring them to intervene. "This is what happens when you defy the law," he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. Each word a hammer strike meant to crush any flicker of resistance. His chest puffed out, reveling in the power he wielded until the crowd parted. A ripple of movement stirred at the edges of the gathering, and a towering figure emerged, his broad shoulders slicing through the sea of bodies like a ship cutting through waves. The man's face was a mask of stone, his dark eyes blazing with a fury so controlled it sent chills down spines. Whispers skittered through the crowd like dry leaves in a windstorm. "That's him," someone murmured, voice hushed with awe. "David Jones." The officer's smirk twitched, then faltered, his pale skin blanching further as recognition sank in. The elderly woman, still clutching her face, let out a faint, trembling gasp. "My son," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread woven with relief and a shadow of something deeper, perhaps dread, perhaps pride. The officer took an involuntary step back, his bravado crumbling like ash under the weight of this new presence. The air grew heavy, electric with anticipation, as the tall man advanced, his every step deliberate, his shadow swallowing the officer whole. The crowd held its breath, senses attuned to the brewing storm. Who was this man? And why did his mere arrival unravel the officer's arrogance so completely? Earlier that day, the mall had been a sanctuary of routine for Mrs. Clinic Jones. She wasn't one for frequent visits. Her knees ached too much, and the crowds often overwhelmed her, but when she did come, she savored the simple pleasures. The rhythmic tap of her cane against the polished tiles was a metronome to her thoughts. As she wandered the wide corridors, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light, today's mission was special, a birthday gift for her grandson, a boy whose laughter was one of the few joys that still warmed her aging heart. She'd just emerged from the bookstore, a small paper bag tucked under her arm, when her sharp eyes caught a troubling scene near the food court. A police officer loomed over a young black teenager, his stance aggressive, his voice barking commands. The boy's hands shook, his wide eyes darting as he stammered explanations that fell on deaf ears. Clinic, with the wisdom carved from decades of witnessing the world's injustices, felt a familiar pang in her chest. She couldn't turn away it when the boy's fear mirrored the countless faces she'd seen over the years. Not when she knew silence was complicity. "Excuse me, officer," she'd called, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. She adjusted her grip on her cane, planting it firmly as she stepped closer. "What's happening here?" The cop, a hulking figure with sweat beading on his brow, barely flicked his eyes her way. "Stay out of this, ma'am." "Police business," he snapped, his tone dismissive, as if her age rendered her invisible. But Clinic wasn't fazed. She'd faced down worse than this in her time, men who thought power came from a badge or a raised voice. "That boy doesn't look like he's done anything wrong," she pressed, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe you should let him be." The officer's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Did I ask for your opinion, lady?" he spat, his patience fraying. In that moment, the teenager seized his chance, slipping into the crowd like a shadow, vanishing before the officer could react. Fury twisted the cop's features, his face reddening as he rounded on Clinic. "You just let a suspect escape," he bellowed, stepping so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Suspect? He's just a child," she countered, her voice rising with a quiet fire. Without warning, his hand shot out, seizing her thin arm in a grip that made her wince. Pain flared through her joints, but she bit back the cry threatening to escape. "You're obstructing justice, ma'am," he hissed, his fingers tightening. Around them, shoppers slowed, their faces etched with confusion and unease. A young woman in a red coat hesitated, her hand hovering over her phone, while an older man in a baseball cap muttered to his wife, debating whether to step in. But before anyone could act, the officer's fist rose, a blur of motion that ended in a brutal strike against Clinic's cheek. The crowd recoiled as one, a chorus of gasps filling the air. She stumbled, her cane clattering against the floor, but she caught herself, her spirit a steel rod bending, but never breaking. The officer stood there, chest heaving, a sneer curling his lips as he surveyed the silent onlookers. He seemed to drink in their fear, his power swelling with every second they remained rooted in place. Then a voice sliced through the tension, clear and commanding. "Step away from my mother." Heads swiveled as David Jones emerged, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the chaos around him. His face was unreadable, a granite wall, but his iced-host's eyes burned with a rage so potent it seemed to hum in the air. Clinic's lips curved into a faint, pained smile. "David," she breathed, her voice a whisper of solace amid the storm. The officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic as the name registered. Murmurs swelled among the crowd. "That's David Jones," a woman in a green scarf whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "The lawyer who took down that crooked precinct last year," a man added, his tone laced with reverence. "He sued the city for brutality and won." The officer's hands, once so eager to strike, now dangled limply at his sides, his bravado draining away like water through a sieve. David stopped before his mother, his gaze locked on the cop with lethal precision. "You have no idea who you just crossed," he said, his voice a low, cutting edge. The officer stammered, grasping for words, but David silenced him with a raised hand. "I'm not here to chat," he continued, his tone steady as granite. "You've said and done more than enough." The crowd pressed closer, phones aloft, capturing every heartbeat of the confrontation. The officer's eyes darted, searching for backup, but the mall's vast expanse offered no refuges. Fellow officers were nowhere to be seen. Then, in a move that made the crowd gasp, David reached into his jacket. The officer flinched, his trembling hand fumbling toward his holster. "Don't move," he barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. David paused, his hand lingering inside his jacket, before slowly withdrawing a sleek black smartphone. He held it up, his calm unshaken. "You thought I was armed?" he asked, disdain dripping from every syllable. "That says more about you than it does about me." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, mingled with shouts of disbelief. David turned to a bystander, a lanky man in a hoodie who'd been recording since the punch landed. "You got all that, right?" The man nodded, his phone unwavering. "Good," David said, his voice resolute, "because I'll make sure this never happens again." The officer, now a quivering shell of his former self, blustered. "You don't know who you're messing with," but his words rang hollow, stripped of their earlier venom. David stepped closer, towering over him, his presence an unyielding force. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said, his voice cold as winter steel. "And trust me, you're the one who should be scared." Earlier that day, David had been hunched over his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating stacks of legal files. A civil rights attorney with a reputation that preceded him. He'd built his career dismantling systems of corruption, case by case. His latest fight was a high-profile battle against police misconduct, a cause that hit close to home. Little did he know the day would bring him face to face with the very injustice. He'd sworn to eradicate an injustice that struck at his own flesh and blood. In that moment, as David stood over the officer, the scene became more than a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Clinic's quiet strength, forged through years of enduring and overcoming, had summoned her son, a man whose life's work was a testament to the lessons she'd instilled, that justice, though often delayed, could not be denied. The officer's abuse of power had rippled outward, touching not just Clinic but the boy he'd harassed, the crowd who'd borne witness, and now David, whose resolve ensured the consequences would echo far beyond this mall. Here amid the polished floors and flickering lights, a lesson unfolded of accountability, of the fragility of unchecked authority, and of the enduring power of those who refuse to bow. On a tranquil afternoon, the stillness in David's office was shattered by the insistent buzz of his phone. His mother, Clinic, wasn't one to interrupt his workday. Her calls were rare, reserved for moments that truly mattered. A flicker of concern sparked in his chest as he snatched the device from his desk, answering without hesitation. Her voice flowed through the line, steady yet laced with an urgency that made his stomach tighten. "I'm at the mall," she said, her words measured but heavy. "There's an officer here, harassing a young boy. I think I might have to do something." David's brow furrowed, his grip on the phone tightening as worry clawed at him. "Mom, please be careful," he urged, his tone sharp with caution. "You know how fast these things can spiral." Clinic's response was calm, resolute. "I know, David. But you taught me to stand for what's right, didn't you?" Before he could muster a reply, the call cut off abruptly, leaving him staring at the blank screen, a cold unease creeping up his spine. He trusted her instinct. She had a quiet strength he'd always admired, but he also knew the volatility of such encounters. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat and keys, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination as he headed for the mall. The scene that greeted him was chaos unfolding in slow motion. The air buzzed with tension as he pushed through a swelling crowd, their murmurs rising like a storm on the horizon. There stood Clinic, her petite frame unyielding, her voice cutting through the noise with a firmness that belied her years. She faced down a uniformed officer, her eyes blazing with righteous indignation as she demanded he leave the trembling boy alone. David's pace quickened, his breath catching as he saw the officer's hand twitch, then lash out. The punch landed before he could reach her, a sickening thud that echoed in his ears. Clinic stumbled but didn't fall, her resolve holding her upright as gasps rippled through the onlookers. David's blood boiled, his fists clenching as he broke through the final ring of spectators. He was too late to stop the blow, but not too late to fight for what came next. Now, the standoff between David and the officer crackled with unspoken fury. The crowd had transformed from mere bystanders into a unified front, their faces etched with anger and disbelief. David stepped forward, his presence commanding, his voice slicing through the thick air like a blade. "I want your badge number," he demanded, each word precise, unyielding. "And the name of your supervisor." The officer faltered, his bravado crumbling as his eyes darted around, seeking an exit that didn't exist. The weight of dozens of stares pinned him in place, and David's patience thinned. "I said now," he repeated, his tone a steel trap snapping shut. Reluctantly, the officer muttered his badge number and precinct, his voice barely audible over the crowd's growing murmur. David's fingers flew across his phone, logging the details with the efficiency of a man who'd spent years in courtrooms, turning chaos into order. The officer sneered under his breath. "This isn't over." David's eyebrow arched, a spark of defiance igniting in his gaze. "Oh, I know it's not. By the time I'm through, you'll be lucky to keep your pension, let alone your job." The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderous wave of support washing over David and Clinic. She stood beside him, a bruise blooming on her cheek, yet her posture radiated pride. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, a silent testament to their shared strength. "Let's get you checked out, Mom," David said, his voice softening as he turned to her, concern threading through his resolve. She nodded, leaning into him as he guided her toward the exit. The sea of people parting with murmurs of respect, their phones still recording every step. Just as freedom beckoned beyond the mall's glass doors, A new voice sliced through the clamor, sharp and authoritative. "Hey, you're not going anywhere." David froze, his jaw tightening as a squad of officers emerged from the shadows, their expressions carved from stone, hands hovering near their belts. The leader, a grizzled man with gray-streaked hair and a stern demeanor, stepped forward, his gaze narrowing as it settled on David and Clinic. "We've got a report of interference with police business," he said, his voice flat, unyielding. David's eyes flashed with incredulity. "Interference?" he echoed, his tone low and dangerous. "You mean protecting my mother from your officers' fists?" The lead officer's face remained impassive, a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "You'll both need to come to the station for questioning." David inhaled deeply, his mind racing like a chess master plotting 10 moves ahead. This wasn't just about Clinic anymore. It was a stand against a system that had crushed too many, beneath its weight for too long. "Fine," he said, his voice steady as granite. "But you'd better have your lawyers on speed dial. I don't bend, and I don't break." The officer signaled his men, who moved with mechanical precision, to escort them out. The crowd surged forward, their shouts a chaotic symphony of fury and encouragement. Phones thrust high to capture the injustice unfolding. As they reached the exit, Clinic's fingers tightened around David's arm, her voice a whisper against the roar. "I'm proud of you." He gave her a curt nod, his resolve a blazing torch in the gathering dark. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, sharper than he'd imagined. A jolt of reality that made Clinic gasp. She clutched his arm as if she could shield him from the indignity, her voice trembling with a cocktail of anger and fear. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her eyes boring into the lead officer. He brushed her off with a dismissive mutter of standard procedure, his tone dripping with apathy. David kept his face a mask of calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Inside, his mind churned, strategizing. Calculators of courtroom battles had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. The crowd trailed them to the police cars, their chants swelling into a deafening crescendo. "Justice for Clinic," someone bellowed, and the words caught fire, spreading through the throng. Reporters descended like vultures, cameras flashing as they jostled for position, turning the scene into a blazing spectacle. In the back of a squad car, David caught the eye of a young journalist, her microphone poised like a weapon. She mouthed, "We've got your back," before spinning to her crew, her voice already weaving the story for the world. He nodded faintly, a spark of gratitude flickering in his chest, though he knew the road ahead would be a war of attrition. At the station, the air was thick with tension, the sterile walls closing in as David and Clinic were separated, each shepherded into a stark interrogation room. David sat beneath a harsh overhead light, the white walls glaring back at him. He'd been in rooms like this countless times, but always as the one asking questions, not the one in chains. The door swung open, and the lead officer entered, flanked by a man in a crisp suit. Captain Harris, the precinct commander, his presence heavy with authority. "Mr. Jones," Harris began, his voice smooth but edged with warning. "I'm sure you understand why you're here." David leaned back, his wrists still bearing the faint red marks of the cuffs, now removed. "I understand you're scrambling to cover for your officer," he replied, his calm laced with steel. "And I also understand you just stepped into a fight you can't win." Harris sighed, crossing his arms as if weary of the game. "We can keep this quiet," he offered, his tone conciliatory. "Cooperate, and we'll sort it out. No need to blow this up." David's lips curved into a smile, cold and unyielding. "You think this is just about me and my mom?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a gavel. "This is about every family like mine, Harris, beaten, broken by men like you who think a badge makes them untouchable." For a fleeting moment, Harris's mask slipped, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he schooled it back into neutrality. "Watch your tone, Mr. Jones," he warned, but David only chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "You still don't see it, do you? The world watched every second of this. It's on every phone, every screen. Your officer's fist, my mother's courage, your standard procedure. You're not burying this." Harris straightened, his jaw tight, but David's words hung in the air, unassailable. Outside, The crowd's chants echoed faintly through the walls, a reminder of the reckoning brewing beyond. Clinic, in her own room, sat with quiet dignity, her thoughts a storm of pride and fear for her son. She'd raised him to fight, but seeing him cuffed had pierced her heart, a mother's anguish warring with her belief in the cause. The young boy from the mall lingered in her mind, his wide eyes and trembling hands a silent plea she couldn't ignore. Back in David's room, the lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a battle won. And the abuse of power carried a price that rippled far beyond the moment. As Harris turned to leave, David's gaze burned into his back, a promise unspoken, but understood this was only the beginning. By the time the sun rose tomorrow, every television screen, radio station, and newsstand across the nation would be buzzing with the story. The carefully constructed veil of secrecy they'd tried to drape over this mess was unraveling, thread by fragile thread, and there was no stitching it back together this time. The lead officer stood in the dimly lit precinct hallway, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the inevitable was pressing down on him. His once boisterous confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a man who couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his uniform sleeve, a nervous tick that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. Captain Harris, standing nearby, caught his subordinate's uneasy glance and held it for a moment, a silent exchange, heavy with unspoken tension before turning his attention back to David. "Fine," Harris said, his voice sharp and clipped like a blade slicing through the thick air. "We'll process you and hand this over to the district attorney. But don't you dare think for a single second that you're above the consequences." His words carried an edge of frustration, a man accustomed to control now grappling with a situation slipping through his fingers. David, unshaken, gave a curt nod, his dark eyes steady and unyielding. "Good," he replied coolly. "Let's get this over with." His tone was resolute, a quiet strength underscoring every syllable, as if he'd already mapped out the battlefield ahead and was ready to charge into it. Meanwhile, in the stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the precinct, a younger officer sat across from Clinic, his notepad trembling slightly in his inexperienced hands. He was tasked with taking her statement, but the weight of her presence seemed to unsettle him. Despite her silver-streaked hair and the faint lines etched into her face by time and trauma, Clinic exuded a calm that filled the room like a steady heartbeat. She sat with her hands folded neatly on the cold metal table, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering as she recounted the day's events with a precision that left no room for doubt. "I saw a boy being harassed," she began, her voice clear and firm, carrying the weight of a mother's instinct and a citizen's outrage. "He was just a child, cornered and scared, and I wasn't about to stand there and let it happen." The young officer scribbled furiously, his pen scratching against the paper as he avoided her piercing eyes. He shifted in his seat, clearly out of his depth, before mustering a response. "And you admit to interfering with police activity?" His voice wavered, uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether he was asking or accusing. Clinic arched a single eyebrow, a subtle gesture that conveyed both disbelief and disdain. "Interfering?" she echoed, her tone laced with quiet indignation. "Is that what you call stepping in to stop a child from being unlawfully detained? Tell me, officer, what would you have done if it were your son out there?" Trembling under the shadow of a badge, the question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable, and the young man faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for water. Before he could cobble together a reply, the door swung open with a creak, and Captain Harris strode in, his presence commanding the room like a sudden gust of wind. "That'll be all," Harris said to the younger officer, his voice low but firm, brooking no argument. The rookie scrambled to gather his notes and pen, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste to escape the tension that crackled between the two figures now facing each other. Harris settled into the vacated seat, his broad frame filling the space as he studied Clinic with a careful, almost wary gaze. "Mrs. Jones," he began, his tone softening slightly, a deliberate shift from the brusque authority he'd wielded with David. "I'm sorry for what happened today. It's obvious you've been through a great deal, and I'd like to make this right." His words were measured, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he knew he was treading on unstable ground. Clinic's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening as she leaned forward ever so slightly. "A great deal," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm that cut through the air like a whip. "Captain, your officer assaulted me in the middle of the street, in broad daylight, with people watching. I'm standing here with bruises on my arms and an ache in my chest, and you call it a great deal? I'm lucky I didn't end up in a hospital bed or worse." Her words were a quiet storm, each one landing with the weight of her lived experience, her resilience shining through the cracks of her exhaustion. Harris nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her rebuke. "I understand," he said, his voice steady but strained. "If you're willing to work with us, we can sort this out quietly. A settlement, perhaps something to keep this from dragging through the courts and causing more trouble. Then it's worth." Clinic leaned forward further, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "Do you know what my son does for a living, Captain?" she asked, her voice slow and deliberate, each word a stone dropped into still water. Harris's face tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Yes," he admitted, his tone clipped. "I'm aware." Clinic's lips pressed into a thin line as she continued, her voice growing even firmer. "Then you should also know that we don't trade our silence for your handouts. You don't get to sweep this under the rug with a check and a pat on the head." Harris exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away from this with some dignity intact," he said, his patience fraying. Clinic's lips curved into a faint, defiant smile. "Dignity isn't something you hand out like a consolation prize, Captain. It's something I've fought for, earned through every step of my life, and I won't let you or anyone strip it away from me." Harris stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the tiled floor, the sound echoing in the small room like a gunshot. "Have it your way," he said, his voice icy, a warning threaded through his words. "But don't expect this to play out the way you imagine." He turned and strode out, leaving the air thick with unresolved tension. Hours later, after David's legal team swooped in with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, both he and Clinic were released on bail. As they stepped out of the precinct into the cool night air, they were engulfed by a chaotic swarm of reporters and supporters. Camera flashes burst like fireworks, illuminating their weary faces, while shouted questions overlapped in a cacophony of noise. David raised a hand, his gesture firm and commanding, silencing the crowd with the authority of a man who knew his purpose. "My mother and I have no comment at this time," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "But mark my words, justice will be served." The crowd erupted in cheers, their belief in him unshakable, a wave of solidarity crashing against the precinct walls. Clinic stood beside her son, her head held high despite the exhaustion that tugged at her every muscle. Her eyes, though tired, gleamed with a fierce pride as she watched David take charge. They pushed through the throng to a waiting car, the flashes of cameras reflecting off the tinted windows as they climbed inside. As the vehicle pulled away, David's phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp vibration that snapped him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, his fingers swift as he opened a message from one of his associates. A link glowed on the screen, and he tapped it, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the headline, "Officer involved in assault. As history of misconduct, new evidence emerges." A grim smile tugged at his lips, a flicker of satisfaction igniting within him. The tide was turning, and he could feel the momentum building beneath his feet. This was only the beginning. Clinic turned to him in the dim light of the car, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. "David, what's next?" He met her gaze, his expression resolute, a fire burning in his dark eyes. "Now we fight," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a vow. The ride home was steeped in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Clinic leaned back against the leather seat, her hand resting lightly on David's, a quiet gesture of unity. Her body ached, her mind raced images of the day flashing behind her closed eyelids like a relentless reel. She'd witnessed injustice before, felt its cold fingers brush against her life, but this time it had grabbed hold of her, shaken her to her core. David, meanwhile, stared out the window at the blurred city lights, his jaw clenched tight. His thoughts were already racing ahead, piecing together strategies, anticipating moves. This wasn't just about his mother anymore, it was about every person Who'd ever been crushed under the weight of a system that protected its own, at the expense of the vulnerable? When they pulled up to Clinic's house, the soft glow of the porch light spilled across the familiar wooden steps, casting a warm halo over the cozy home she'd built over decades. She sighed, a sound of relief tinged with weariness, as she stepped out of the car. This was her sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos had always been held at bay until now. They'd barely crossed the threshold, coats still on their shoulders, when a sharp knock rattled the door. David exchanged a wary glance with his mother, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. He leaned forward, peering through the peephole, and saw a man in his late 30s standing on the porch, dressed in a crisp suit. His face was serious, but lacked the predatory edge of the reporters they'd just escaped. David cracked the door open cautiously. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone guarded. The man extended a business card, his movements steady and deliberate. "Mr. Jones, my name's Stephen Clark. I'm a reporter with the Observer." David didn't reach for the card, his skepticism a shield. "I appreciate your interest, but we've got nothing to say right now." Stephen nodded, unfazed. "I get that, and I respect it. But I'm not here to dig for a soundbite or exploit what happened. I want to help." David's brow furrowed. Curiosity piqued despite his exhaustion. "Help how?" Stephen glanced around, lowering his voice as if the night itself might be listening. "There's more to this officer than you know. He's been tangled up in incidents like this before multiple times, and every time, the department's buried it. I've been tracking him for months." David frowned, finally taking the card and turning it over in his hand. "Why come to me?" Stephen's eyes met his, steady and earnest. "Because right now, you've got the leverage to blow this wide open. People are watching, listening. If we team up, we can expose the corruption and make sure justice isn't just a word they throw around to shut us up." David considered this, the weight of the day pressing against his resolve. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, Clinic perched on the edge of her worn but beloved sofa, her hands clasped tightly as Stephen laid out his findings. The officer's name was Daniel Monroe, a man with a rap sheet of excessive force complaints stretching back years, most against Black and Latino individuals. Lawsuits had been filed, voices had cried out, but each time, the complaints vanished into the ether, buried under layers of bureaucracy and intimidation. Stephen pulled a thick folder from his bag, spreading its contents across the coffee table. Dog-eared documents, grainy photos, internal memos stamped with red ink. "This is everything I've dug up," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Complaints, cover-ups, even Bodycam footage that mysteriously disappeared. I got my hands on it." Clinic's breath caught as she sifted through the evidence, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against a photo of a young man with a bruised face, his eyes wide with fear. "How does he still have a badge with all this?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and righteous anger. Stephen sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's the same old story. The department shields its own. Victims are either too terrified to push forward or paid off to keep quiet. Power protects itself. Mrs. Jones, it always has." David flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each revelation, a storm brewing behind his calm exterior. "Not this time," he said, his voice low and unyielding. "We're not letting them bury this one." Stephen nodded, a spark of hope lighting his tired eyes. "That's what I was counting on. I've got a piece in the works. School'd have it ready by tomorrow morning if you're in. With your cooperation, we can make sure the whole country sees this for what it is." Clinic looked at her son, her gaze searching his face. "David, are you sure about this? Once this goes out, there's no turning back. They'll come for you, for us." David placed a hand over hers, his touch warm and steady. "Mom, we've been fighting our whole lives. This is just one more battle, but it's one we can't walk away from. Justice isn't just a hope, it's a promise we have to keep for everyone who's been silenced." The room fell silent, the gravity of their decision settling over them like a heavy cloak. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, but within these walls, a fire was kindling, fueled by the unyielding pursuit of what was right. Monroe's abuses of power had gone unchecked for too long. A stark reminder that authority without accountability was a weapon wielded against the defenseless. For Clinic, it was personal, a mother's fury at seeing her values trampled in the daylight. For David, it was a calling, a chance to wield his influence to dismantle a system rotten at its core. And for Stephen, it was a crusade, years of chasing shadows finally converging on a moment of truth. Together, they stood at the precipice, ready to leap into the fray, knowing that the consequences of this fight would ripple far beyond their own lives. A lesson in justice that would echo through the ages. The air buzzed with tension as dawn broke over the city, a restless energy coursing through its streets like an electric current. Clinic stood in the quiet of her modest kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, her gaze fixed on her son, David. Pride swelled in her chest, a fierce and unshakable force, as she watched him prepare for yet another battle in a war they'd both silently vowed to fight. Her eyes traced the lines of his determined face, noting the way his brow furrowed with focus, the way his jaw tightened with resolve. "I'm not backing down, Mom," he'd said the night before, his voice steady despite the storm brewing around them. She'd nodded then, her heart a tangled mix of admiration and dread, knowing full well what they were up against. "Then let's do it," she'd replied, her tone soft but ironclad. And now, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, the article they'd poured their souls into struck the internet. With the ferocity of a lightning bolt splitting the sky, the headline blazed across screens everywhere, exposing Officer Daniel Monroe, a legacy of violence and corruption. Each word was a carefully honed blade, cutting through years of silence and deceit. David had spent months unearthing the truth, piecing together a mosaic of brutality that painted Monroe not as a guardian of the law, but as a predator cloaked in its authority. The article chronicled every incident: beatings swept under the rug, complaints buried in bureaucratic quicksand, witnesses silenced by fear or payoffs. It was a portrait of a man who'd wielded his badge like a weapon, his power a shield against accountability, and it landed with devastating force. Within minutes, the digital world ignited. Social media platforms trembled under the weight of outrage. Hashtags like Justice for Clinic surging to life as strangers and survivors alike found their voices. By mid-morning, news anchors were reciting David's words to millions, their polished voices amplifying a story that could no longer be ignored. The city pulsed with a collective fury, a demand for justice that reverberated from cramped apartments to gleaming office towers. At the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. Captain Harris stood in his cluttered office, the blinds half drawn against the chaos outside, his weathered face etched with a scowl as he watched the news unfold on a flickering TV screen. Reports flashed across the display, each one a hammer blow to the department's fragile reputation. He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, his mind racing through strategies to contain the damage. He'd spent decades navigating scandals, smoothing over cracks in the system. But this was a fissure too wide to patch. His officers shuffled past his door, their whispers a low hum of panic, their eyes darting nervously toward the growing crowd beyond the precinct's walls. Harris knew they were teetering on the edge of a reckoning, and for the first time in years, he felt the cold grip of uncertainty tighten around him. The door burst open with a bang, and Officer Daniel Monroe stormed in, his broad frame filling the room with a volatile energy. His face was a mask of crimson fury, veins bulging at his temples as he slammed a meaty fist onto Harris's desk. "You're just going to let them smear me like this?" he roared, his voice thick with indignation. Papers scattered under the force of his blow, a pen clattering to the floor. Harris met his glare with a steely calm, though his stomach churned with disgust. "You've put us in an impossible position, Monroe," he said, his words clipped and deliberate. "I told you to lay low, to keep your damn head down, and now we're drowning in your mess." Monroe's eyes narrowed, his chest heaving as he leaned closer, his breath hot and ragged. "They're lying. That reporter twisted everything. Those stories are bullshit." Harris shook his head slowly, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him like a physical burden. "It's too solid, Daniel. The paper trail, the witness, it's all there. We've got no choice but to suspend you pending an investigation." Monroe's face contorted with rage, a snarl twisting his lips as he jabbed a finger at Harris. "You're throwing me under the bus." Harris rose from his chair, his voice dropping to a frigid whisper. "You drove yourself there, Monroe. Now get out of my office." Across town, David's small law office buzzed with a frenetic energy. His team huddled over desks littered with legal pads and coffee cups, their voices overlapping as they drafted a civil lawsuit that could topple the precinct's house of cards. Phones rang incessantly, each call a thread in a growing tapestry of pain victims stepping forward, their trembling voices recounting horrors long buried. David sat at his desk, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up as he pored over case files, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and hope. A soft knock broke his concentration, and he glanced up to see his assistant, Mia, peering through the doorway. Her usual brightness was tempered by a flicker of unease. "David, you've got a visitor," she said, her tone hesitant. He arched an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Who is it?" Mia shrugged, her fingers twisting nervously. She wouldn't say her name, but she insists it's urgent. David nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Send her in." The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, her presence tentative, yet weighted with purpose. She was in her mid-40s, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face carved with lines of worry that spoke of sleepless nights and buried secrets. Linda Carter clutched a worn manila folder to her chest, her knuckles white from the pressure, as if it were both a lifeline and a curse. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice quavering as she hovered near the doorway. David gestured to the chair across from him, his expression softening. "Please sit." "What can I do for you, Ms. Carter?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting shadows to leap out, then sank into the seat. With trembling hands, she slid the folder across the desk. "I'm a former officer from Monroe's precinct," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been holding onto this for years. Mails, reports, recordings, proof of what was happening, what they covered up. I couldn't live with the guilt anymore, but I was too afraid to speak." David opened the folder, his breath catching as he scanned the contents. Pages of correspondence, audio transcripts. Mamasa was a goldmine, a raw and unfiltered glimpse into a department rotten to its core. "Why now?" he asked, looking up to meet her tear-filled gaze. Linda's lips trembled, her hands wringing together in her lap. "Because of you and your mother. You're giving people hope, showing them they don't have to be silent. I want to help." David's chest tightened with a surge of gratitude and resolve. "Thank you, Linda. This could change everything." As she rose to leave, she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful, Mr. Jones. Monroe's not the only one you're fighting. There are people higher up who'll do anything to protect themselves." She slipped out, leaving David alone with the folder, his mind racing as the stakes soared into uncharted territory. By late afternoon, the city was a tinderbox. Protesters swarmed the precinct steps, their signs thrust high, their voices a thunderous chorus that rattled the windows. No justice, no peace, no racist police. The sun dipped low, bathing the scene in a blood-red glow. As David stood on the steps of his office, watching the crowd swell, his phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A text from Stephen Clark, the tenacious reporter who'd broken the story. "Contact inside precinct says they're scrambling. Tonight's press conference could be a face save or a sacrifice. Monroe might be the lamb." David sighed, his legal team already stretched thin, racing against time to bolster their case. Mia's voice cut through his thoughts. "David, you need to see this." Inside, the TV blared with a live feed. Captain Harris at a podium, flanked by stone-faced officers, his grim expression a mask of control. "We understand the community's concerns," he began, his voice slicing through the crowd's jeers. "Effective immediately. Officer Daniel Monroe is on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We're committed to transparency." The crowd erupted, a cacophony of cheers and boos. But David's eyes narrowed. Harris's words were too polished, too hollow. Clinic sank onto the couch beside him, her face a storm of worry and pride. "That's not enough," she muttered, her voice heavy with skepticism. "They're tossing Monroe out to quiet the noise without owning up to the rot." David nodded, his jaw tight. "They're buying time." The press conference dragged on, reporters lobbing questions like grenades. One pierced the air. What about the department's history of ignoring complaints against Monroe? Harris sidestepped, his response a vague promise of new policies. As it ended, Stephen called, his voice crackling with excitement. They're sacrificing Monroe to save their skins, but they're not ready for what's next. I've got internal emails. Monroe wasn't alone. There's a network, David, officers covering for each other. I'm sending the files. David's pulse quickened as the emails hit the web that night, damning proof of a conspiracy, sprawling beyond Monroe, implicating a web of corruption that reached into the precinct's upper ranks. Social media erupted anew, Expositha system trending as the city braced for the fallout. Justice, David knew, was a blade that cut both ways, and the consequences of power's abuse were only beginning to unfold. The city streets buzzed with unrest, a restless energy surging through the crowds as millions tuned into the unfolding story. Protests erupted like wildfire, their flames licking across city lines, swelling in size and intensity until the pressure bore down on the police department with unrelenting force. Inside the precinct, Captain Harris paced the worn floorboards of his office, each step echoing the burden that threatened to crush him. The scandal wasn't just a stain, it was a sledgehammer, pounding at the fragile walls of his authority. His phone jolted to life, shattering the tense silence. On the other end, the mayor's voice cut through, sharp and unyielding. Harris, we're in the middle of a damn crisis, the mayor barked, his bluntness leaving no room for debate. This mess has grown legs. It's not just about one rogue cop anymore. The people out there are baying for blood. Harris gripped the receiver tighter, his knuckles whitening. I know, sir, he replied, his voice taut with strain. We're throwing everything we've got at this. The mayor's retort was swift and biting. Everything. It's not enough, Harris. If you don't rein this in, your badge is the next thing they'll take. Fix it. The line went dead, and Harris slammed his fist into the desk, the impact reverberating through the room. David Jones was the thorn in his side, a relentless force driving this chaos, and Harris could feel his options slipping away like sand through his fingers. Meanwhile, across town at Clink's house, a quieter but no less suffocating tension hung in the air. David sat hunched over a table strewn with papers, his brow furrowed as he sifted through the latest scraps of evidence with his small, determined team. In the kitchen, Clink moved with mechanical precision, setting a kettle on the stove, her hands trembling as she tried to anchor herself in the mundane. Steam curled upward as the water hissed, but her thoughts churned with the weight of the past few days. Pride swelled in her chest for Davida's courage, his unshakable resolve. A bit beneath it lurked a gnawing dread, a whisper that they were teetering on the edge of something perilous. The sharp rap of knuckles against the front door jolted her from her reverie, her teacup clattering against the counter. She glanced at the clock, its hands pointed to an hour too late for unannounced guests. David, she called, her voice quivering with unease. He was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room with measured steps, his hand brushing the doorframe as he leaned in. Who's there? He asked, his tone steady but laced with caution. It's Linda, came the reply, a familiar voice tinged with strain. David swung the door open, revealing Linda Carter, the ex-officer whose bravery had handed them a critical piece of the puzzle. But the calm confidence she once carried had evaporated. Her eyes darted like a hunted animal's. Her coat clutched tightly around her as if it could shield her from the world. Linda, what's wrong? David asked, stepping aside to usher her in, his concern sharpening his words. She slipped past him, her breath shallow. They know, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might summon her pursuers. Someone at the precinct spotted me at the protest. I've been followed ever since. Clink's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp, her eyes wide with alarm. Followed. Are you certain? She pressed, her voice trembling. Linda nodded, her movements jerky. I didn't come straight. Her ray twisted through every back alley I could think of, but my place isn't safe tonight. I had nowhere else to go. David rested a firm, steadying hand on her shoulder, his touch a silent promise. You're safe here, Linda. You did the right thing. We'll protect you. Tears brimmed in her eyes, spilling over as her composure cracked. I didn't think it had come to this, she choked out. David's gaze hardened, but his voice remained even. This is what happens when you challenge their power. They lash out. But we're not stopping that now. Before they could linger on the moment, David's phone buzzed sharply against the table. He snatched it up, his eyes narrowing at the unknown number flashing on the screen. The message was stark. You think you're safe. You're not. Drop the case, or your family pays. His jaw tightened as he tilted the phone toward Clink and Linda. Clink's face drained of color, her breath catching in her throat, while Linda let out a strangled gasp. What do we do now? Clink whispered, her voice fragile, barely holding together. David's eyes blazed with a fierce resolve. We push forward. They're scared, terrified enough to threaten us. That means we're close. Clink nodded, her fear still etched into every line of her face. But David's certainty anchored her. He knew the path ahead was treacherous, a tightrope over a chasm. But justice glimmered within reach, and he'd be damned if he let anyone snuff it out. As the night stretched on, the small group huddled in Clink's dimly lit living room, the weight of their defiance pressing down on them. Outside, the city simmered, its streets alive with the restless hum of protest and the distant wail of sirens. Shadows shifted beyond the windows, unseen threats lurking just out of sight. Morning crept in slowly, the sky blushing with the first hints of dawn, stirring the city to life. But for David, sleep was a distant dream, an indulgence he couldn't afford. He sat alone in his cluttered office, the threatening text glowing on his phone like a taunt. His mind raced, mapping out strategies, weighing risks, each thought a thread in a tightening web. Clink slipped in quietly, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She set it before him, her face a storm of worry and quiet strength. You can't let them get to you, she said softly, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. David met her gaze, nodding slowly. I won't, Mom, but it's bigger than we imagined. They're desperate. She squeezed his shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. Desperate people slip up, David. Use that. Before he could reply, his assistant, a weary young woman named Tara, burst in, clutching a laptop, her eyes wide with urgency. You need to see this, she said, slamming the device onto the desk and pulling up a live news feed. The anchor's voice crackled through, grim and measured. Breaking news late last night. An explosive device was found outside the offices of civil rights attorney David Jones. Authorities safely disarmed it, and no one was harmed. Police are treating this as a potential act of intimidation, tied to Jones's ongoing clash with the department. Clink's hand flew to her chest, a sharp intake of breath betraying her shock. David's eyes narrowed as he watched the screen, the footage painting a stark picture. Bomb squad trucks parked outside his office, their red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. This is their escalation, he muttered, his voice low but unyielding. They're trying to drown us in fear. Clink shook her head, her resolve hardening. They won't get away with it. Tara, still rattled, her hands trembling slightly, spoke up. What's the plan? Do we back off? David's response was immediate, firm as steel. No. We double down. This proves they're cornered. They've got everything to lose. The precinct, meanwhile, was a pressure cooker ready to blow. Captain Harris stormed into the briefing room, his heavy footsteps reverberating off the walls as he hurled a thick folder onto the table. His officers sat in stony silence, their faces taut, none more so than Monroe, the suspended cop whose defiance had fueled this fire. What the hell were you thinking? Harris roared, his voice a thunderclap. A bomb. Are you trying to bury this department? Monroe leaned back, a smug grin curling his lips, unfazed by the outburst. I didn't plant anything, he drawled, his tone dripping with arrogance. But if someone did, it sure as hell sent a message. Harris's glare could have melted steel. The only message it sends is that we're spiraling out of control. The mayor's on my back, the media's feasting, and you're sitting there grinning like a fool. Monroe's smirk faded, his eyes darkening. You think I'll be the scapegoat if this blows up? Harris didn't hesitate. Damn right you will. You're the easiest fall guy we've got. Monroe shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor, the sound raw and jarring. You'll regret that. He spat, storming out and slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Harris watched him go, a cold dread settling into his bones. The reins were slipping from his grasp, and he could feel the collapse looming. Back at Clink's, David gathered his legal team in the cramped living room. the air thick with determination and unease. Stephen Clark, a weary journalist with a sharp mind, sat beside Linda Carter, who twisted a tissue in her hands, her nerves fraying with every passing minute. Jamal, a young lawyer with a quiet intensity, leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "We've got to keep the public in the loop, let them see how deep this corruption runs." David nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "Stephen, write another piece. Highlight the bomb threat, what it means. We're not just chasing justice, we're up against a machine that'll crush anyone to save itself." Stephen's pen was already moving, his nod brisk. "It's done." Nearby, Linda's hands stilled, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't sign up for bombs, David. I just wanted the truth out." He turned to her, his gaze softening but firm. "You're braver than you know, Linda. We're in this together." As evening fell, David retreated to a makeshift office, poring over case files under the dim glow of a lamp. His phone buzzed again, another message flickering to life, its words a chilling echo of the fight ahead. Outside, the city pulsed with tension, a storm brewing in the shadows. And David knew the lesson was clear: power, when abused, sought its own destruction. Justice demanded a price, but it was one he'd pay to see it through. In a sprawling city where the skyline shimmered under a relentless sun, the streets buzzed with the restless energy of lives intertwined. Dust swirled in the air, carried by a dry wind that swept through cracked pavement and past weathered buildings. The faint drone of traffic mingled with the sharp calls of street vendors, painting a vivid tapestry of sound and motion. Amid this restless world stood David Jones, a man whose quiet demeanor belied the storm raging within him. He was no stranger to pressure, but tonight, as he sat hunched over his cluttered desk, the weight of the unknown pressed harder than ever. The clock ticked toward midnight when his phone vibrated against the wood, jolting him from his thoughts. A message from the forensic analyst flashed across the screen. "I've got something big. The figure in the footage isn't some lowlife thug. Details coming soon." David's heart thumped wildly in his chest, a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his tousled hair. This wasn't just another clue, it felt like the hinge on which everything might turn. He could sense it in his bones, a visceral certainty that they were teetering on the edge of something massive. Just as he reached for his jacket to call it a night, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. "David, you need to get to the hospital." Stephen's voice crackled through the line, tight with urgency. David froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "What? Why?" he demanded, his stomach twisting into knots. "It's Linda," Stephen replied, his words heavy with dread. "She was attacked on her way home. She's in critical condition." The world seemed to tilt beneath David's feet. His blood turned to ice, a chilling numbness spreading through him as he stammered, "I'm on my way." The hospital loomed ahead, its stark white walls glowing under the harsh glare of floodlights. Inside, the air was thick with the antiseptic sting of bleach and the muted hum of machinery. David burst into the waiting room, his breath ragged, and found Clinic and Stephen huddled together. Clinic's eyes were swollen, rimmed with red, tears streaking her cheeks like fragile rivers. Stephen stood beside her, his broad shoulders slumped, his usually steady gaze clouded with shock. "What happened?" David asked, his voice taut, barely containing the storm of worry and rage brewing inside him. "They ran her off the road," Stephen explained, his hands clenching into fists as he spoke. "Her car flipped. She's lucky to be alive." David's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he balled his hands at his sides. Anger surged through him, hot and fierce, mingling with a gnawing guilt that clawed at his chest. He should have seen this coming. "Is she going to make it?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his efforts to steady it. Clinic nodded, though her face was etched with grim uncertainty. "She's stable for now, but the doctors say it's going to be a long, hard road to recovery." David sank into a chair, the plastic creaking under his weight. His mind spun like a top, thoughts colliding in a chaotic whirl. This wasn't just a warning shot, it was a declaration of war. "They're trying to shut her up," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "But they won't. We won't let them." Clinic rested a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You need to watch yourself, David," she warned, her voice quivering with fear. They're getting bolder, more vicious. He met her gaze, his eyes burning with resolve. I know, he said, steady now. But this only makes me more determined. He glanced toward Linda's room, where she lay beyond the glass, and made a silent vow. He would see this through, no matter the cost. Yet, deep down, a shadow of dread lingered, whispering that the worst was still lurking on the horizon. The hospital's sterile chill clung to David as he sat outside Linda's room, his head cradled in his hands. Through the narrow window in the door, he could see her pale and still, tethered to a web of tubes and wires. The machines beeped softly, a rhythmic lifeline that felt both comforting and cruel. Bruises mottled her face, dark and angry against her ashen skin, and her arm rested in a bulky cast, a testament to the violence she'd endured. Clinic sat beside him, her presence a quiet anchor. She rubbed his back in slow, soothing circles, her voice soft as she murmured, "She's tough, David. She'll fight her way back." He nodded absently, but his thoughts were 1,000 miles away. The escalation wasn't random. They were closing in on something explosive, something worth killing for. But what, and who was orchestrating this chaos? His spiraling thoughts shattered as Jamal burst into the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the tiled floor. He clutched a folder, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "David," he panted, "we've got a breakthrough." David shot to his feet, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Jamal thrust the folder forward, his dark eyes gleaming with urgency. Matthews was part of an internal task force handling sensitive cases. He's linked to cover-ups, dozens of them, all targeting vulnerable communities. David's fists clenched, a fresh wave of fury surging through him. "This is bigger than we imagined," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of realization. "We have to expose this now." That night, David gathered his legal team, Stephen, and a handful of trusted community leaders for a virtual meeting. The glow of his laptop bathed his face in cold blue light as he laid out their plan. The room crackled with tension, but beneath it burned a fierce determination. "We've got enough to blow this wide open," David said, his words sharp and deliberate. "Not just Monroe, but the whole rotten network." Stephen leaned into the frame, his brow furrowed. "I've written an article tying Monroe, Matthews, and the task force together. Pair it with a press release from your team, and it'll hit like a tidal wave from the screen." Miss Carter, an older woman with silver hair and a voice like steel, spoke up. "David, this isn't just your battle, or your mother's, it's ours. The whole community's ready to stand with you." Gratitude swelled in his chest. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said. "We'll need every ounce of that strength. They won't go down easy." As the meeting wrapped up, David felt a fire reignite within him. The puzzle pieces were snapping into place, and they were on the cusp of victory. But the stakes had never been higher. By morning, the article roared into the world, web of corruption. How a police task force buried decades of abuse. It laid bare Monroe's crimes, Matthews's arson, and the task force's chokehold on justice. The city erupted. Crowds flooded the streets, their chants for accountability shaking the air. The mayor, cornered by the outrage, announced an emergency review of the police department, his voice trembling over the airwaves. Inside the precinct, chaos reigned. Captain Harris stood at the head of a conference room, his face pale and slick with sweat. He slammed a newspaper onto the table, the headline screaming their downfall. "They've connected it all," he barked, his voice splintering. Matthews lounged at the far end, his cool facade cracking. "We can spin this," he said, shrugging. "Call it a smear job." Harris's eyes blazed as he leaned forward. "Spin it. You were caught on tape tossing a Molotov. You idiot. You've dragged us all into the fire." Before Matthews could retort, an officer burst in, clutching a tablet. "Captain, you've got to see this." Harris snatched it, his heart pounding as he watched the mayor's live address promising a sweeping investigation. "Your time is up," the mayor declared. Harris set the tablet down, his mind reeling. Their empire was crumbling. At David's makeshift office, the team watched the mayor's speech with cautious triumph. "This is huge," Jamal said, a grin breaking through his exhaustion. David nodded, but his jaw remained tight. "It's progress, but they'll lash out harder now." As they strategized, his phone buzzed on unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, "Mr. Jones," a deep voice rumbled. "I warned you." David's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening. "Who is this?" The voice laughed, low and menacing. "You know who I am, and what I can do. Last chance to back off." David's resolve hardened. "We're done running. Your threats don't work anymore." The line went dead, and he set the phone down, his face a mask of steel. "They're scared," he said. "Good." That night, the war escalated. David pored over files at home, the dim glow of a lamp casting shadows across the room, when a sharp knock startled him. His security detail stood at the door, their faces grim. "Mr. Jones, we've got trouble," one said. David's gut clenched. "What's happening?" "A breach at your mother's house," the guard replied. "They got away, but they left this." He handed David a scorched scrap of paper. Scrawled in black ink were the words, "You can't protect everyone." His heart thundered as he dialed his mother, the lesson of justice and the cost of power echoing louder than ever in his mind. They'd crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. David's voice trembled with urgency as he clutched the phone, his knuckles whitening against the strain. "Okay, are you sure you're all right?" he asked, the tightness in his chest making every word feel like a plea. On the other end, Clinic's tone was steady, but laced with a quiet tension that betrayed her calm facade. "I'm fine." "David," the security team swept in faster than I expected. "They've got everything under control here." But she hesitated, and he could almost see the furrow of her brow, the way her lips pressed together when she was wrestling with something heavy. "I can't shake this feeling, David. It's like they're tightening the noose around us." He let out a long, shuddering breath, a storm of relief and fury swirling within him. Relief that she was unharmed, fury that their enemies faceless, relentless were still circling like vultures. "They're trying to rattle us," he said, his voice dropping low, edged with a defiance that had been forged through months of sleepless nights and whispered threats. "They want us to break, to scatter, but they won't win. Clinic, they can't." Her response came firm and resolute, a lifeline in the chaos. "No, they won't. We've clawed our way too far to let them drag us back now." David hung up and turned sharply to the security team gathered in the driveway, their faces shadowed under the dim glow of the streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the faint hum of the city beyond. "Increase the patrols," he ordered, his tone clipped and commanding. "I want eyes on every entrance front, back, sides, every damn window around the clock. No one moves alone, not even to grab a coffee." "Understood." The lead guard, a broad-shouldered man named Harris with a scar tracing his jawline, gave a curt nod. "We've got it covered, sir. No one's slipping through." His confidence was reassuring, but David couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at him as he stepped into his home. The moment he crossed the threshold, his eyes locked onto the wall. Crimson letters sprawled across the plaster in a jagged, taunting scrawl, a message meant to pierce his resolve. The words screamed of intimidation, a promise of retribution, but they only steeled his determination further. He stood there, fists clenched, staring at the threat as if he could will it away. They wouldn't stop him. They couldn't. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a war for justice, a reckoning for every soul crushed under the weight of unchecked power. Inside, the house buzzed with a restless energy. The air felt heavy, saturated with the unspoken dread of what might come next. The security team moved with practiced efficiency, their boots thudding softly against the hardwood as they reinforced every door, every window. Clinic lingered near David, her presence a quiet anchor amid the storm. Her dark eyes shimmered with worry, but her jaw was set. Her shoulders squared an unspoken vow that she'd stand with him no matter the cost. They both knew it. The final clash was looming, a shadow creeping closer with every tick of the clock. Their enemies had exhausted their playbook through its violence, surveillance, and now the endgame was in sight. David gathered his team in the living room, the weight of their mission pressing down like a physical force. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the worn furniture. "We've come too far to back down now," he said, his voice steady but crackling with a raw urgency that electrified the air. "We've got everything we need: evidence, witnesses, the truth to dismantle this rotten system. But tonight, we brace ourselves for the worst." Stephen, perched on the edge of the couch, fidgeted with his camera, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the lens. A weary man with a mop of unkempt hair, he'd always been the quiet one. But his eyes burned with purpose. "If they come for us," he said, his voice soft but resolute, "we'll make damn sure the world sees every second of it." Jamal, sprawled in an armchair, nodded in agreement, his usual easy grin replaced by a grim determination. "We've got backup secure ones. Even if they take us out, the evidence lives on. The truth'll hit the streets no matter what." His hands, rough from years of manual labor, rested on his knees, steady and ready. Detective Reed, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, let out a low grunt. A grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual scowl. He'd seen his share of shadows. "I've waded through some ugly messes in my time," he said, his voice gravelly. "But this is the kind of fight that rewrites the rules. Win or lose, nothing's the same after this." Clinic rose to her feet, her movements deliberate, her presence radiating a quiet strength that silenced the room. "No matter what comes crashing through that door," she said, her voice soft but unyielding, "we face it together. They can't silence us, all not if we refuse to bend." Her words hung in the air, a rallying cry that stitched their fractured spirits into something unbreakable. As night draped the city in a suffocating stillness, David paced near the window, his eyes darting to the shadows beyond the glass. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. He couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, a prickling at the base of his neck that refused to fade. He checked his phone again, thumbing through the encrypted files they'd uploaded to the Cloudfree damning document, every recorded confession. His gaze flicked to the tracking beacon the security team had discovered earlier that day, a sleek black device no bigger than a coin, still blinking faintly on the table. They knew where he was. They'd always known. A crackle broke the silence, the guard's voice bursting through the radio. "We've got movement at the perimeter." David's heart slammed against his ribs as he rushed to the security monitors. The grainy footage flickered, revealing dark figures creeping toward the property from multiple angles. Their movements were precise, synchronized a predator's advance. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl, thick with resolve. The team sprang into motion, a flurry of controlled chaos. Guards took up defensive positions, their weapons glinting faintly in the dim light, while Clinic ushered Stephen, Jamal, and Reed to the reinforced back room. David lingered near the front door, his pulse roaring in his ears. Hiding wasn't an option for him. The first bang reverberated through the house, a violent shudder as the intruders tested the door's strength. The guards barked orders, their voices cutting through the tension as warning shots split the night outside. A deep, guttural voice bellowed from beyond the walls. "David Jones, you've been warned. Surrender now, and this ends clean." David stepped forward, his boots thudding against the floor, and shouted back, his voice a defiant roar. "I'm right here. You want me? Come take me." Another crash followed, louder this time, as glass shattered somewhere down the hall. The guards fired again, their bullets pinging off the intruder's armor, holding them at bay for a fleeting moment. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, before a blinding flash tore through the darkness. A deafening blast rocked the front yard, the smoke bomb's haze swallowing the house in an instant. "Hold your positions," a guard yelled, his voice nearly lost in the chaos. David felt Clinic's hand grip his arm, her fingers trembling but firm. "David, please be careful," she whispered, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't hide. "I will," he promised, though his mind was a whirlwind of strategy and adrenaline. He turned to Stephen, who crouched nearby, camera rolling. "You getting this?" Stephen nodded, sweat beading on his forehead, every frame. The world's watching. Through the choking smoke, David glimpsed themselves, armed to the teeth, closing in with lethal intent. But just as they reached the porch, a piercing wail shattered the night. Sirens, red and blue lights slashed through the haze as police vehicles screeched into view. Surrounding the property, the intruders froze, their plan unraveling in an instant. Officers spilled from the cars, weapons drawn, their shouts a chaotic symphony of authority. Within minutes, the attackers were on their knees, disarmed and cuffed, their faces a mix of rage and disbelief. David stood rooted to the spot, his breath ragged, as Captain Harris emerged from the lead vehicle. The older man's face was unreadable, his gray eyes scanning the scene before settling on David. "You okay?" Harris asked, his tone gruff but tinged with something softer concern. "Maybe." David nodded warily, his trust in the system long since shattered. "What's this, another game to shield your own?" Harris shook his head, a rare crack in his stoic mask. "Not this time. We've got Monroe in custody is spilling everything. Ravenstone, the bribes, the hits who know it all. I'm here to fix this mess." David narrowed his eyes, searching for the lie, but Harris pressed on. "I'm done covering for the wrong people. This is about doing what's right for once." The words lingered, heavy with implication, and David let them settle before responding. "You've got a hell of a lot to prove if you want this city to believe you." Harris nodded, unflinching. "I know, but tonight we stop them. That's where it starts." As the police hauled the intruders away, the night air grew still again, the tension bleeding out into the dawn. By morning, the story had erupted across every screen and headline. Corruption ring busted after failed attack. On civil rights lawyer Stevens' footage raw, unfiltered spread like wildfire, showing the intruders' assault and the police swooping in at the 11th hour. It was a stark portrait of a corrupt network finally crumbling under its own weight. David sat with Clinic on the couch, the TV flickering with their triumph. For the first time in weeks, a fragile peace settled over him, though he knew the war wasn't over. She squeezed his hand, her touch warm and grounding. "You did it, David. You stood up for what's right." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, we did it, all of us." Stephen burst in, phone in hand, his excitement palpable. "The governor's office called. They want a meeting. They're talking about overhauling the whole damn police system." Jamal trailed behind, his grin wide and unrestrained. "And civil rights groups from coast to coast are blowing up our lines. They want our case to light the way." David leaned back, the magnitude of their victory sinking in. "We've struck a chord," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But there's more to do." Clinic's smile was radiant, her faith unshaken. "And we'll be ready." In the weeks that followed, the city transformed. Deputy Chief Ronald Weaver and a slew of high-ranking officials faced formal charges, their corrupt empire exposed in excruciating detail. Ravenstone Security, the shadowy paramilitary outfit hired to crush dissent, was dismantled, its leaders behind bars, its operations reduced to ash. The task force David had battled to create was finally purging the rot. But for him, this wasn't the finish line. It was a launch pad. One crisp afternoon, he stood before City Hall, a sea of faces stretching out before him, activists, supporters, reporters, all hanging on his words. Clinic stood at his side, her quiet strength a beacon of hope. "The fight for justice doesn't end with one win," he declared, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "It's a fire we keep burning, a promise we keep fighting for, because when power goes unchecked, it's the people who pay the price. And we've seen what happens when we stand up. The mighty fall, and the truth rises." The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderous testament to the change they'd ignited. David's gaze swept over them, his heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. They'd faced terror, loss, and betrayal, but they'd emerged unbroken. Justice had clawed its way to the surface, a brutal lesson in the cost of power's abuse and a warning to those who'd dare repeat it. The road ahead was long, but David was ready. This wasn't just a victory, it was a call to arms, and he'd lead it with every breath he had left. In the wake of dismantling a deeply corrupt system, the air crackled with a restless energy, an urgent call to construct something greater in its place. The old ways had crumbled, leaving behind a void that demanded to be filled with a structure designed to cradle and shield every soul within its reach, not merely the fortunate few who had long reaped its benefits. The crowd gathered in the streets, buzzed with a fervor that pulsed through the cobblestones, their voices rising in a chorus of triumph and resolve. Among them stood a tapestry of humanity, community leaders with weathered faces etched by years of quiet struggle, civil rights advocates whose fiery spirits had never dimmed, and families whose tears had watered the ground beneath them, their pain born from the brutality of a police network that had twisted justice into a weapon. Their hands gripped signs aloft, bold letters screaming justice for all and reform now. Each word a defiant brushstroke on the canvas of a new dawn. David stood at the heart of it all, his voice cutting through the clamor like a lighthouse beam piercing a stormy night. It held steady, unwavering, a testament to the fire that burned within him. "Today," he declared, his tone rich with pride and purpose, "I'm honored to unveil the Clinic Jones Foundation for Justice and Reform." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise. This foundation will be a relentless force offering legal aid to those crushed underfoot, pushing for laws that reflect fairness, and ensuring that no one else endures the torment my mother and countless others have faced. The crowd erupted, their cheers a tidal wave crashing against the remnants of the old regime. David's chest tightened with a surge of determination, a resolve so fierce it felt like it might split him open. Then Clinic stepped forward, her presence a quiet storm of strength and vulnerability intertwined. Her voice trembled not with fear, but with the raw, unshakable emotion of someone who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. "This foundation isn't just a building or a name," she said, her words soft yet piercing. "It's hope made real. It's about us standing shoulder to shoulder, lifting one another from the ashes, and refusing to bow to the weight of injustice." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, reflecting the faces of those who had gathered, each one a mirror of her own grief and grit. The crowd roared again, a thunderous swell of applause that shook the earth beneath their feet. For David, it was as if a dam had burst within him, flooding his soul with a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation wasn't just a project, it was a lighthouse, a vow etched in stone to keep fighting for equality and accountability, until the scales of justice tipped true. As days stretched into weeks, the foundation took root with a vigor that surprised even its founders. Its offices hummed with activity, wires pouring over files, volunteers answering calls from desperate voices, and advocates meeting with lawmakers to carve out reforms that carried real weight. It became a lifeline for those battered by police misconduct, offering not just legal support, but a hand to hold in the dark. David's name began to ripple across the nation, his story a spark that ignited others to rise in their own towns and cities. Yet the path was far from smooth. Reform was a jagged road, lined with thorns of resistance from those who clung to the old ways like drowning men to a sinking ship. Criticism rained down from entrenched institution scold, calculated voices dismissing him as a dreamer chasing shadows. Skeptics sneered, their doubt a heavy fog that threatened to choke the light of progress. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of amber and ash, David sat hunched over a desk cluttered with case files. The foundation's office buzzed around him, a hive of purpose. But his world had narrowed to the pages before Heimlich won a story of suffering that fueled his relentless drive. Clinic appeared in the doorway, to steaming mugs of tea cradled in her hands. "You've been at this all day," she said gently, setting one mug before him with a care that belied her stern tone. "Take a breath, David." He leaned back, a tired smile tugging at his lips, the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones like damp earth. "I suppose I've been a little lost in it," he admitted, his voice rough with overuse. Clinic settled across from him, her gaze warm and steady, a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "You've already moved mountains," she said, her words a balm, "but you don't have to carry them all alone." He nodded, the truth of her words sinking in as his shoulders sagged under the day's burdens. "I know," he murmured, his eyes drifting to the papers strewn across the desk. "It's just every time I think of how many lives that corruption touched, how many at Broquet feel this need to keep going, to not stop until it's fixed." Clinic reached across the table, her hand finding his, her touch a lifeline tethering him to the present. "And you will," she assured him, her voice firm yet tender. "But even the strongest warriors need to rest." They sat there in a silence that felt like a soft blanket, sipping their tea as the hum of the office faded into the background. The past few months pressed against theme, a tapestry of victories and wounds, but woven through it was the glimmer of a future they could shape together. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, but in that moment, they knew they were walking it right. One crisp morning, an envelope arrived, its seal gleaming with the weight of opportunity. David tore it open to find an invitation to speak at a national summit on justice reform in Washington, D.C., a gathering of leaders from every corner of the country, united to forge strategies that could reshape the system at its core. It was a chance to amplify their fight, to carry their torch onto a grander stage. As he prepared his speech, David's mind wandered back through the years to the fist that had sparked it all. The arrests of titans who had once seemed untouchable. Every step a brick laid on the path to this moment. The day of the summit dawned bright and cold, the auditorium packed with faces eager for change. Clinic sat in the front row, her eyes alight with a pride that warmed him from across the room. "My name is David Jones," he began, his voice ringing out like a bell through the vast space. "I am the son of a woman who refused to let her voice be snuffed out. And I stand here today because justice isn't just a word, it's a battle cry." He spoke of the strength found in unity, the unshakable need for accountability, and the quiet power of empathy in those who lead. He wove in the lessons carved from their struggle, a warning of what happens when power festers unchecked, and painted a vision of a world where justice wasn't a privilege, but a birthright. The audience surged to their feet, their applause a rolling thunder that echoed off the walls. Clinic rose with them, a tear tracing a silent path down her cheek as she clapped, her heart swelling with the weight of what they'd built. That night, on the balcony of their hotel, the city lights sprawling beneath them like a sea of stars, Clinic's voice broke the stillness. "We've come so far," she said, her tone soft with wonder. David nodded, his gaze lost in the horizon, thoughts churning beneath his calm exterior. "And we're only beginning," he replied, the words a vow as much as a truth. The fight for justice had carried them here, but their work stretched onward, a horizon yet to be claimed. Their story didn't end with that summit. It blossomed into a beacon that lit fires across the nation. David and Clinic became symbols of resilience, their names whispered in homes and shouted in streets, not just as champions of their community, but as emblems of hope for every movement, daring to dream of reform. The pressure they wielded pressed against lawmakers and institutions like a tide, forcing cracks in the walls of the old guard. Investigations into the corrupt precinct spiraled outward, unearthing rot that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. High-ranking officials fell, their cuffs clinking like the sound of justice finding its footing. New policies emerged from the rubble, body cameras strapped to every officer, independent committees rising to hear the people's cries, training that stripped bias bare, and initiatives that stitched trust back into the frayed fabric between police and those they swore to serve. The Clinic Jones Foundation grew into a bustling nerve center, its doors flung wide to offer legal aid, training for advocates, and resources to towns wrestling with their own shadows. Clinic and David crisscrossed the country, their voices ringing out at rallies, their hands clasped with activists who saw in them a mirror of their own defiance. In a dusty Mississippi town, a young woman approached Clinic after a speech, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and resolve. "Your courage's why I'm fighting now," she said, her voice trembling with newfound strength. Clinic's heart clenched, a reminder that their work wasn't just about loss, it was about breathing life into the downtrodden, giving them the tools to stand tall against the weight of oppression. But their light cast shadows, too. Resistance reared its head, fierce and unrelenting. Opponents painted them as radicals in venomous media campaigns, accusing them of tearing down the very order that kept society afloat. Police unions pushed back, grumbling that the new rules bound their hands too tight. Threats became a grim rhythm, letters slipped under doors, voices hissing through phone lines. A brick shattering Clinic's window one moonless night, yet fear didn't break them. It forged them anew. David turned to innovation, partnering with tech minds to birth apps that let citizens capture misconduct in real time, their evidence locked safe in blockchain's unyielding grip. Clinic poured her soul into healing, gathering officers and residents in circles of raw, honest talk spaces where wounds could breathe and trust could take root. Their story sparked a wildfire, igniting a movement that swept the nation. Communities rose, inspired by the echoes of Clinic and David's footsteps, launching their own battles against the injustices festering in their corners. Grassroots groups sprouted like wildflowers, each one a seedling of the Clinic Jones Foundation, reaching for the same justice, unyielding consequences for those who dared to abuse their power, and a future where hope wasn't a whisper but a roar. The lesson was clear: power unchecked rots, but justice, tempered by community and courage, endures. And in their hearts, Clinic and David carried the unshakable truth that the best chapters of their tale were still unwritten, waiting to be forged in the fires of their unwavering resolve. In the heart of Detroit, where the skyline met crumbling neighborhoods and the echoes of inequality reverberated through housing, education, and healthcare, a group of determined young activists stood at a crossroads. Their city was a patchwork of dreams deferred and resilience unbroken, and they had grown tired of watching their communities suffer under the weight of neglect. Inspired by a woman named Clink, whose courage burned like a beacon through the haze of despair, they fought tirelessly to pass tenant protection laws. Clink wasn't just a name to them, she was a living testament to the idea that justice wasn't a distant fantasy but a prize worth claiming, no matter how steep the climb. Their victory rippled outward, a stone tossed into a still pond, stirring waves of hope that reached far beyond the city's borders. Letters began arriving, carried by the wind from corners of the globe as distant as South Africa. One man's words trembled on the page as he wrote, "Your battle mirrors ours," a reminder etched in sweat and tears that justice demands a fight, whatever the sacrifice. His gratitude was a thread connecting struggles across continents, a quiet acknowledgement that Clink and her son David had lit a spark others could follow. Each letter piled onto the last, a chorus of voices thanking them for proving that even in the shadowed corners of the world, fairness could take root if someone dared to plant the seed. Clink would sit at her worn kitchen table, tracing her fingers over the handwriting, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. David, ever her shadow and strength, would watch her silently, his own heart buoyed by the realization that their defiance had become a lighthouse for the lost. But the road didn't smooth out with triumph. The old guard entrenched institutions and politicians who clung to power like ivy to a crumbling wall pushed back with a ferocity that tested the activists' resolve. Meetings dragged into late hours, the air thick with cigarette smoke and frustration as reforms stalled in the hands of those who preferred the status quo. Clink felt the weight of it in her bones, her once steady hands trembling as she pored over legal texts, searching for loopholes to outmaneuver their opponents. David, younger but no less weary, paced the room during those endless nights, his mind racing with strategies while his stomach knotted with dread. They both knew the fight was far from over, that every step forward invited a harder shove backward. Yet they pressed on, their belief in unity and perseverance a shield against the storm. In quiet moments, Clink would whisper to herself, "One spark can light 1,000 fires." Her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. Their journey taught them lessons carved deep into their souls. Courage wasn't a single act, but a flame that could spread, igniting others to rise. Change demanded more than bravery, it required a stubborn refusal to bend, a resilience forged in the crucible of resistance. And above all, they learned that the true power to reshape a broken system lay in the hands of a community, woven together by shared purpose. Clink had a gift for reaching even the hardest hearts, her empathy a bridge spanning divides that seemed impossible to cross. She'd sit with skeptics in dingy diners, her eyes soft but unyielding, listening to their fears before gently dismantling their defenses with words that felt like a warm hand on a cold shoulder. David marveled at her patience, knowing it was a strength he was still learning to wield. Years later, they stood in a park baptized in Clink's name, a vibrant oasis carved out of the city's concrete sprawl. The air buzzed with life, children's laughter danced on the breeze, families sprawled on blankets beneath sprawling oaks, and a mural stretched across a weathered wall, its colors vivid with scenes of their struggle. Clink's words were painted beneath it in bold, flowing script. "Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey, and we walk together." She stood there, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her eyes tracing the faces of those who now thrived in the space she'd helped create. David, older now, his face lined with the wisdom of battles won and lost, had become a leader in his own right. He'd shepherded reforms through hostile councils, mentored wide-eyed activists who reminded him of his younger self, and carried his mother's torch with a quiet ferocity. Turning to her, he grinned, a rare softness breaking through his usual stoicism. "You started all this, Mom," he said, his voice thick with reverence. Clink shook her head, her smile weary but warm. "No, we started it together and there's still miles to go." Their story wove itself into the fabric of Detroit, a testament to the unyielding might of courage, community, and the relentless pursuit of what was right. It whispered to future generations that the fight for a better world was worth every bruise, every sleepless night, every tear shed in the face of overwhelming odds. They'd stared down fear, danced with danger, and weathered resistance that would have broken lesser spirits. But their determination had carved a path toward a society where justice wasn't just a word, but a living, breathing promise. The lesson lingered in the air like the scent of rain after a drought. Power, when abused, sows its own downfall, and those who stand united can topple even the mightiest towers. Far from the city, on a sprawling 50-acre farm where the sun dipped low and painted the horizon gold, Elijah Carter stood amid rows of sweet corn and collard greens. The earth beneath his boots was rich and dark, its scent rising thick and comforting, mingling with the hum of cicadas in the fading light. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief worn thin by years of use, his hands rough and calloused, each crease a story of decades spent coaxing life from the soil. This land wasn't just his livelihood, it was his blood, a legacy handed down through 3 generations of Carters who'd poured their sweat into its furrows. But today, as he leaned against his rusted tractor, savoring a fleeting moment of peace, something felt off, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. A plume of dust rose in the distance, accompanied by the guttural roar of a patrol car tearing through the stillness. Elijah's heart sank, a stone dropping into the pit of his stomach. Trouble had a knack for finding him, even here in the sanctuary of his fields. The car screeched to a halt at the edge of his property, gravel spraying like shrapnel, and out stepped Officer Craig Hensley. His crisp white uniform gleamed in the dying light, a stark contrast to the scowl twisting his thin lips and the cold glint in his narrowed eyes. Elijah knew him by sight and reputation, a man who wore his badge like a crown, enforcing rules that bent to his whims, especially when it came to men like Elijah, black men who dared to claim a piece of the world for themselves. "Evening, Mr. Carter," Hensley drawled, his voice dripping with a condescension that made Elijah's skin prickle. "Got a few questions about some suspicious activity reported round here." Suspicious activity? Elijah's mind spun, but he kept his face a mask of calm, his dark eyes steady as they met Hensley's. "Well, officer," he said, his tone smooth as the river rocks lining his fields, "you're welcome to take a look, but all you'll find here is hard work and good soil." Hensley didn't respond, his gaze sweeping over the land with a disdain that felt like a physical weight. To Elijah, this farm was a monument to pride and perseverance, but in Hensley's eyes, it was a stage for something sinister, a place to assert his dominance. The officer sauntered forward, his boots crunching deliberately on the gravel drive, each step a calculated performance of power. He carried himself like a king surveying a conquered realm, his shoulders squared, his chin tilted just so. "Mind telling me what's in those barns over there?" he asked, jerking his head toward the 2 weathered structures perched at the property's edge. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression polite but unyielding. "Equipment and seed stock for next season," he replied. "Nothing too exciting, I'd reckon." Hensley's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, a predator's grin. "Well, I'll be the judge of that," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. Elijah's jaw tightened, a flicker of tension he buried beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't about barns or seeds, they both knew it. Hensley wasn't here chasing evidence. He was here to remind Elijah of an unspoken hierarchy, to flex a power that thrived on intimidation. "Let's not waste time," Hensley snapped, pulling a pair of gloves from his belt and snapping them onto his hands with a flourish. Like a surgeon preparing to dissect, "Step aside, Mr. Carter. I'll have a look myself." Elijah didn't budge, his 6-foot frame rooted to the earth, his broad shoulders unbowed. "With all due respect, officer," he said, his voice a low rumble, "do you have a warrant? This is private property, and last I checked, the law still matters." Hensley bristled, his hand twitching toward his holster, his authority challenged in a way that clearly stung. "Don't get smart with me, Carter," he hissed, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You got something to hide in there." Elijah crossed his arms, his stance unwavering. "Hiding something and expecting my rights ain't the same thing, officer." The air between them thickened, heavy with humidity and unspoken threats. Hensley leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "All right, then. If that's how you want to play it, maybe I'll bring the dogs out tomorrow. See what they sniff out." Heard whispers about farmers like you cutting corners or worse. "Farmers like me." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his tone deceptively mild. Hensley's smirk widened, venomous and deliberate. "You know exactly what I mean." Elijah's pulse thundered in his ears, but he held his ground, his face a fortress of composure. This wasn't Newman like Hensley had been testing him his whole life, probing for weakness, waiting for him to crumble. But something ignited within him, a quiet fire stoked by years of enduring and overcoming. Hensley had crossed a line, stepping onto Elijah's Landis legacy, and Elijah wouldn't let him rewrite the script so easily. The sun sank lower, shadows stretching long and jagged across the fields. Elijah took a measured step back, his posture relaxed, but his mind a whirlwind of calculation. He'd faced men like Hensley before, petty tyrants who brandished their power like a club, eager to beat down anyone who didn't fit their mold. But Elijah had learned a truth they couldn't touch. Real strength came from within, from knowing your worth and refusing to bow. "Officer Hensley," he said, his voice steady as the oak trees lining his property. "I don't mind you looking, but you'll need to do it right. This is my land. I've worked it my whole life, and everything here's honest." Hensley smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "A whole life, huh? And yet, I bet there's plenty here that could look questionable, enough to stir up trouble. You sure you want to make this hard?" The threat hung between them, sharp and cold. But Elijah didn't flinch. He knew what was at stake in not just his farm, but his dignity, his right to exist unbowed. If he gave in now, Hensley would return, each visit a tighter noose. But Elijah wasn't built to break. "I'd like to think we both respect the law," he said, choosing his words like stones for a foundation. "You wouldn't want to step on my rights any more than I'd want to waste your time." The standoff lingered, a silent battle waged in the fading light. Hensley's power was a hollow thing. Elijah realized a bully's bluster propped up by a badge. But justice, true justice, was a journey, not a gift handed down by men like him. And Elijah, like Clink and David before him, would walk that path with his head high, knowing the consequences of unchecked power could never silence the will to stand tall. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across Elijah Carter's sprawling farm as the standoff unfolded. Officer Hensley stood before him, his lips curling into a smirk that flickered briefly, betraying a crack in his smug armor. "You like tossing around those fancy quotes when it suits you, don't you?" Hensley sneered, his voice thick with disdain, as though he could unravel Elijah with words alone. The air between them hummed with a restless energy, charged by the weight of their mutual defiance. Elijah's dark eyes narrowed, glinting like polished steel under the fading light. "Only when I'm certain they're true," he shot back, his tone slicing through the officer's arrogance with surgical precision. His heart thudded against his ribs, a steady drumbeat pulsing in his temples. But he willed his hands to stay still, his posture unyielding. If Hensley thought he could rattle him with a few barbed words and a badge, he was gravely underestimating the man standing on this hard-earned soil. Their gazes locked, a silent battlefield stretching between them, neither willing to blink first. After what felt like an eternity, Hensley broke the silence, his voice dripping with a mockery so forced it almost sounded rehearsed. "Well, Mr. Carter," he drawled, dragging out the syllables as if tasting them, "I suppose I'll just have to handle this the right way then. But don't fool yourself into thinking this is over. I'll be back, mark my words, and when I am, I'll dig up every last secret you've got buried here." His threat hung heavy in the air, a dark promise wrapped in false civility. Elijah didn't flinch. "I hear you loud and clear," he replied, his voice carrying a quiet strength, tempered with an edge of iron. "And when you do, I'll be waiting." Hensley's glare lingered, sharp and predatory, before he spun on his heel with a grunt, his boots kicking up dust as he stormed back to his patrol car. The engine roared to life, a guttural snarl that shattered the stillness, and the vehicle tore off down the dirt road, leaving behind a swirling cloud of grit that stung Elijah's eyes. He stood motionless, watching until the car crested the hill and vanished, his mind already whirring with what came next. Hensley's words weren't empty bluster. Elijah knew that much. The officer's pride had been pricked, and he'd return with a vengeance, hell-bent on bending the truth to fit his warped sense of justice. But Elijah wasn't the type to cower. Deep in his chest, a plan was taking root, a way to strip away Hensley's mask and reveal the rot beneath. This farm has sanctuary. His family's legacy was just land. It was a testament to survival, and he'd be damned if he let a bully in uniform tear it down. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but Elijah had never shied away from a fight worth winning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Elijah remained rooted to his spot, the day's burden settling onto his broad shoulders like a heavy cloak. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a quiet whisper of doubt he refused to entertain. He didn't know exactly how this would play out, but one truth burned bright in his soul: Hensley wouldn't break him. Not today, not ever. That night, the kitchen was a pocket of stillness, the only sound the low, steady hum of the ancient refrigerator in the corner. Elijah sat at the weathered oak table, its surface scarred from decades of use, his hands cradling a chipped mug of black coffee. The steam curled upward, mingling with the thick anticipation that filled the room. Spread before him were stacks of paper deeds, permits, tax records, receipts for every tractor, every sack of seed, every nail driven into this place. It was his armor, proof of his honesty meticulously gathered over years. His face, bathed in the dim glow of a single bulb overhead, was calm, almost peaceful. But beneath that serenity simmered a fire. He took a slow sip, the coffee's bitterness anchoring him as his thoughts drifted. Hensley didn't care about evidence. The man was hunting for a flaw, any crack he could widen into a weapon. If he couldn't find one, Elijah had no doubt he'd invent it. This fight wasn't just about protecting his land, it was personal, visceral. He was defending the memory of his father, who'd wrestled these fields into submission with calloused hands, and his grandfather, who'd scraped together every penny to claim this soil in an era when a black man owning anything was a radical act. This farm was more than dirt and crops. It was a living defiance, a middle finger to every injustice that had tried to crush his bloodline. Losing it wasn't an option. The next morning, before the first rays of dawn crept over the hills, Elijah was already moving. With a lantern swinging in his grip, he walked the edges of his property, the cool air biting at his skin. He checked every gate, tugging at the latches to ensure they held firm, every lock gleaming with fresh oil, every fence post standing tall. If Hensley came sniffing around again, he'd find nothing to sink his claws into. By mid-morning, as the sun climbed higher, a familiar figure appeared at the end of his driveway. Miss Thelma, his sharp-eyed neighbor, her silver hair glinting like a beacon. She carried a woven basket brimming with ripe peaches, their scent sweet and heavy. But her real gift was the warning in her gaze. Words already flying. "Elijah," she said, her voice low and gravelly. Seasoned by 7 decades of hard-earned wisdom, she stepped closer, her worn sneakers crunching on the gravel. "That officer's been flapping his gums all over town, saying you're hiding something out here. You know how folks get tongues wagging, heads turning. You watch yourself, you hear?" Elijah offered her a warm smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes, masking the storm brewing inside. "Thank you, Miss Thelma. I'll be all right. Hensley doesn't scare me." She shook her head, her lips pursing in a mix of admiration and worry. "You've got a patient soul, child, more than most. But men like him, they don't take kindly to no. Be smart." She pressed the basket into his hands and shuffled off, leaving him with her words echoing in his ears. Her caution only sharpened his resolve. Hensley wasn't just coming for his land, he was trying to poison his name, to sow mistrust among the tight-knit folks who'd known Elijah's family for generations. He wouldn't let that stand. By noon, a plan crystallized. He made calls to a handful of trusted allies in town, people who'd seen his sweat-soaked labor, who'd shared meals at his table, who knew the marrow of his character. If Hensley thought he could corner him, he'd soon discover the strength of a community united. Later that day, as the sun blazed overhead, Elijah spotted a car idling just beyond his property line. It wasn't Hensley's patrol cruiser, but the silhouette inside was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, stiff posture, a predator lying in wait. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. With a stride as steady as the earth beneath him, he crossed the field, his work boots sinking into the soft soil. He reached the fence, leaning against it with deliberate ease, arms crossed, and met Hensley's stare head-on. The officer's eyes gleamed with something dark, a hunger for control, but Elijah held his ground. For a long, taut moment, they were statues, wills clashing in the silence. Then Hensley's car peeled away, tires spitting gravel, and Elijah exhaled, already plotting his next move. The following dawn broke with a soft glow, the sky streaked with lavender and gold. Elijah stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the dew shimmer across his fields like a sea of tiny diamonds. Hensley's threats lingered like a storm cloud, but fear had no foothold here. Instead, a quiet resolve bloomed within him. Wouldn't just weather this, he'd turn it on its head. By mid-morning, he was behind the wheel of his battered pickup, the engine rumbling as he rolled into town. The local feed store, usually a sleepy outpost, buzzed with chatter, the air thick with curiosity. Eyes tracked him as he stepped inside, whispers trailing him like shadows. Mr. Grayson, the store's grizzled owner, leaned over the counter. His weathered face creased with concern. "Heard you tangled with Hensley. You holding up okay?" Elijah nodded, his smile steady. "I'm good, Mr. Grayson, but I think the officers got some wrong ideas about my place." Grayson's frown deepened, his voice dropping low. "Hensley's got a knack for stirring pots that don't need stirring. You need anything, you holler." Elijah's eyes lit up with a spark of inspiration. "Actually, could I post something on your board?" He held up a flyer, its bold letters proclaiming, "Carter Farm Open House. Come, see where your food grows. Tour the land, taste the harvest, learn our story. All welcome." Grayson chuckled, pinning it up with a weathered thumb. "Clever, Elijah. Let 'em see the truth with their own eyes." That day, Elijah wove through town, dropping flyers at the diner, the hardware store, the barber shop, chatting up folks with his easy warmth. He even rang a couple of local reporters, pitching a story on sustainable farming. By the time he rumbled back home, his plan was sprouting. Transparry would be his shield, his weapon. Let Hensley try to spin shadows when the whole town could walk his fields and taste his honesty. That evening, as crickets sang their nightly hymn and the sky darkened, Elijah sat on his porch, gazing at the horizon. His thoughts drifted to his father, a man who'd faced down hatred with a shovel and a stubborn heart, and his grandfather, who'd planted roots in a world that wanted him uprooted. Their legacy pulsed in this land, and Elijah felt its weight, its pride. Headlights pierced the dusk, and his jaw tightened as Hensley's car rolled up. The officer stepped out, leaning on the fence with a smirk that oozed confidence. "Heard you're throwing a party, Carter. Cute move." Elijah rose, his silhouette stark against the porch light. "I believe in being open, officer. Nothing to hide here, and I'm happy to prove it." Hensley's grin twisted, a flicker of malice in his eyes. "Enjoy it while it lasts. I'll be back with a warrant. See how your little show holds up then." Elijah's voice was granite. "Do what you've got to do. I'll be here." Hensley lingered, then slunk back to his car and drove off, leaving Elijah alone with the night and his unyielding will. The open house dawned crisp and bright, the sky a canvas of endless blue. Elijah had been up since before the roosters, setting out tables piled with tomatoes, corn, and peaches, their colors vivid against the weathered wood. Hand-painted signs detailed his farming methods, while a row of faded photos traced his family's journey. Snapshots of resilience etched in sepia and sweat. Cars crunched up the driveway by mid-morning, spilling out families, friends, and skeptics clutching his flyers. Miss Thelma arrived with a knowing nod, Mr. Grayson with a clap on the shoulder, and a young reporter with a notepad and a grin. Elijah greeted them all, his voice steady, his smile masking the tension coiled in his gut. As the crowd swelled, he led tours through the fields, his hands gesturing to the soil that had borne his family's dreams. Children laughed, chasing each other between rows of corn, while adults sampled his harvest. Their murmurs of approval a quiet victory. The reporter scribbled notes, asking about his grandfather's first harvest, and Elijah's chest swelled with pride. This wasn't just about saving his farm, it was about justice, about showing that power misused would always meet resistance. Hensley could come with his warrants and his sneers, but Elijah had built something stronger, a truth too bright to bury. The day stretched long and golden over Carter Farms, the air thick with the scent of freshly turned earth and ripened fruit. Elijah Carter stood at the edge of his sprawling fields, his broad shoulders squared against the horizon, watching as dust swirled in the distance. Another vehicle was approaching it, one of the beat-up pickups or family vans that had rolled in all morning for the open house, but something sleeker, more deliberate. The car slowed to a stop, its tires crunching gravel with an ominous finality. Out stepped Officer Hensley, his unmarked sedan gleaming under the midday sun like a predator's eye. He wasn't in uniform, but the stiff authority in his gait screamed louder than any badge ever could. His face was a mask unreadable, cold, and calculating, sending a ripple of unease through Elijah's chest. The crowd gathered near the farmhouse noticed him too. Whispers buzzed like summer flies, heads turning as Hensley's shadow cut through the cheerful chaos of the day. He wasn't a man you could ignore. His presence carried weight, a silent demand for attention that made the air feel heavier. Elijah straightened, brushing dirt from his calloused hands, and walked forward to meet him. "Welcome to Carter Farms, officer," he said, his voice steady as he extended a hand. "Glad you could make it." The words were warm, but beneath them lay a quiet challenge, a thread of steel woven into his hospitality. Hensley didn't even glance at the offered handshake. His sharp eyes roamed the Senate tables laden with strawberries and watermelon, the clusters of neighbors laughing, the children darting between rows of crops, taking it all in with a skepticism that bordered on disdain. "Quite the turnout, Carter," he said, his tone flat but edged with suspicion. "Hope you're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes with this little spectacle." Elijah's smile held firm, unshaken by the jab. "Not at all," he replied, meeting Hensley's gaze head-on. "In fact, I'm glad you're here. Transparency matters, don't you think?" His words hung in the air, daring Hensley to disagree. The officer's lips pressed into a thin, tight line, his jaw flexing as if biting back a retort. Before he could fire one off, a sharp voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Officer Hensley," Miss Thelma called, stepping forward with the kind of no-nonsense stride that made even the boldest men pause. She was a weary woman, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes glinting with the fire of someone who'd seen too much to tolerate fools. "What brings you out here today? You don't strike me as the farming type." A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd, lightening the mood for a fleeting moment. Hensley's face tightened, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the irritation simmering beneath. "Just making sure everything's above board, Mum," he said, his voice clipped. "No harm in that." Miss Thelma's eyes narrowed, her hands planting firmly on her hips. "Well, it looks more than above board to me," she shot back, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Elijah's farm has been the heart of this community for decades, longer than you've been swinging that badge around, I'd wager." Her words carried the weight of history, a reminder of the roots that ran deep in this land, roots Hensley couldn't hope to uproot with his petty suspicions. Elijah seized the moment, turning to the crowd with a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank you all for coming today," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "This land's been in my family for generations, worked by my granddaddy's hands, my daddy's, and now mine. I'm proud to open it up to you. If you've got questions or want a tour, I'm here." The guests clapped, a polite but genuine wave of appreciation rolling through them. Some drifted toward the tables, drawn by the promise of fresh fruit, while others lingered, eager to hear more. Elijah caught Hensley out of the corner of his eye, still hovering at the crowd's edge. The officer's expression had darkened, his lips curling as if the joy unfolding before him was a personal insult. As the afternoon wore on, Elijah led small groups through the fields, his boots sinking into the soft earth with every step. He pointed out the neat rows of crops, explaining how he rotated them to keep the soil alive, how he conserved water with tricks his father had taught him. His voice was steady, rich with pride as he traced the farm's stories of lean years and bountiful ones, of resilience carved into every furrow. Children squealed as they plucked strawberries, their fingers stained red with juice, while neighbors swapped stories over wedges of watermelon, the sweetness mingling with their laughter. A young reporter darted between groups, her pencil scratching furiously against her notepad, her camera clicking to capture the scene. It was a picture of unity, of life thriving against all odds. But Hensley wasn't part of it. Elijah spotted him slipping away from the crowd, his movements quiet but deliberate, like a fox stalking prey. The officer's eyes were fixed on the barns, their weathered wood standing tall against the sky. Elijah excused himself from the tour, his heart thudding a little faster as he closed the distance. "Something I can help you with, officer?" he asked, planting himself firmly in Hensley's path. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a warning wrapped in courtesy. "Just looking around," Hensley replied, feigning a casual air that didn't match the sharpness in his gaze. "Seems like a lot of folks don't know what might be lurking behind closed doors." Elijah didn't budge, his stance solid as the oak trees lining the property. "You're welcome to look," he said evenly, "as long as you've got a warrant." Hensley's mask of politeness slipped, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you're clever, don't you, Carter?" he hissed, stepping closer. "This little show won't change what's coming." Elijah's smile cooled, but his resolve didn't waver. "It's not about being clever, officer. It's about doing what's right. And as you can see, I've got nothing to hide." For a long, taut moment, they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Hensley's authority as badge, his power had been challenged in a way he clearly hadn't expected. His jaw clenched so hard Elijah could hear his teeth grind. Finally, the officer stepped back, his retreat stiff with barely contained fury. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning toward his car. Elijah watched him go, the tension in his shoulders easing only slightly as the sedan peeled away, kicking up a cloud of dust. The open house had been a triumph of vivid testament to trust and community. But Elijah knew Hensley wasn't finished. A man like that didn't slink off for good. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the fields in shades of gold and crimson, the last guests lingered. They stood in small knots, reluctant to leave the warmth of shared stories and easy laughter. Elijah moved among them, shaking hands, exchanging quiet words of gratitude. Each clasp of a palm, each nod of respect, felt like a brick in the wall. He was building a wall not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever felt the sting of misused power. When the final car rumbled down the road, he stood alone on the porch, the evening breeze tugging at his shirt. Exhaustion settled into his bones, but so did a flicker of hope. Hensley might wield the law like a club, but Elijah had something stronger, people who believed in him. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams tangled with shadows of gravel and glinting badges. Morning broke with a harsh jolt, unmistakable crunch of tires on the drive. Elijah rolled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floor as he crossed to the window. There was Hensley's patrol car, flanked by two others, their engines idling like a pack of wolves circling a kill. The officer stepped out, his uniform crisp now, his posture radiating menace. Two deputies followed, their faces blank, but their movements rigid, as if they'd been drilled to obey without question. Elijah pulled on his boots, his pulse hammering in his throat, but his face stayed calm as he stepped outside. "Good morning, Officer Hensley," he said, his voice smooth despite the storm brewing inside. "What brings you back so early?" Hensley didn't waste time with pleasantries. He held up a folded paper, its edges sharp against the dawn light. "Got ourselves a warrant, Carter," he said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Time to see what you've been hiding." Elijah's stomach twisted, but he kept his expression neutral. He took the warrant, his eyes scanning the text, every detail in place, every loophole sealed. Hensley had come prepared. "You're welcome to look," Elijah said, handing it back. "Like I told you, there's nothing to find." Hensley's smirk widened as he gestured to the deputies. They marched toward the barns, their boots pounding the gravel in unison. Elijah followed, his hands loose at his sides, refusing to let fear take root. Inside the first barn, The air was thick with the scent of hay and oil. Hensley tore into the space like a man possessed, yanking open crates, rifling through sacks of seed, shoving tools aside with growing frustration. The deputies moved more cautiously, their hands methodical, but their eyes darting to their boss's mounting agitation. "Looks like you keep this place tidy," one of them muttered, his tone almost sheepish. Hensley's head snapped around, his glare silencing the man instantly. They moved to the second barn, where the tractor loomed like a silent sentinel. Hensley attacked it with the same fervor, climbing shelves, kicking crates, his breaths coming harder as he found nothing but honest work staring back at him. Elijah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching the officer unravel. "Everything all right, officer?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet defiance. "Seems like you're struggling to find whatever it is you're after." Hensley's face flushed, his hands balling into fists. "Don't get cocky, Carter," he growled. "Just because I didn't find anything today doesn't mean you're off the hook." Elijah's gaze turned hard, unyielding. "You came onto my land with a warrant, tore through my barns, and found exactly what I said you would. Nothing. So tell me, officer, what am I not in the clear about?" The deputies shifted, their discomfort palpable. They weren't used to seeing Hensley flounder like this, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own failure. But the officer wasn't ready to surrender. He closed the gap between them, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You might think you're smart, Carter, but I know your type. Always hiding something. Always gaming the system. I'll find it, even if it takes me years." Elijah didn't flinch, didn't step back. "You're welcome to waste your time," he said, his tone as steady as the ground beneath him. "But while you're chasing ghosts, I'll be here, working this land like my family always has. No amount of your bullying will change that." The air crackled with unspoken threats. The two men locked in a standoff that felt like it could ignite at any second. Finally, Hensley spun away, barking at the deputies to follow. They retreated without a word, their cars roaring off in a haze of dust. Elijah watched until they were gone, his chest loosening only when the last echo faded. Inside the house, he sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. His fingers drummed against the wood, restless, until he reached for his phone. He needed more than just his own strength. No, needed the town. Dialing Pastor Green's number, he felt a surge of resolve. The pastor answered on the second ring, his deep voice a balm against Elijah's frayed nerves. "Pastor Green, it's Elijah Carter," he said, leaning back. "I could use your help." Pastor Green was no ordinary preacher. He was a towering figure in the community, his broad frame matched by a spirit that had weathered storms of injustice. His sermons weren't just words, they were calls to action, rallying cries for fairness that echoed far beyond the church walls. "Elijah," he said, his warmth tinged with concern, "I've heard what's been going on. That officer's been a plague on this town too long. What do you need?" "I need the truth to outshine his lies," Elijah replied, his voice firm. "He came back this morning with a warrant, tore my barns apart looking for something to pin on me. Found nothing, just like I knew he would. I want people to know what's really happening." There was a pause, the pastor's silence heavy with thought. "Then, you've got my support, Elijah. Let me make some calls. We'll get this town behind you." By day's end, word had spread like wildfire. A meeting was set for the next evening at the church. Elijah spent the hours preparing, gathering receipts, logs, anything that proved his farm was clean. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about every soul who'd ever been crushed under the heel of someone like Hensley. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire you stoked, a stand you took. And as the sun set, painting the fields in fiery hues, Elijah felt that fire burning brighter than ever. The church was packed the next night, pews groaning under the weight of a community roused to action. Faces glowed with a mix of worry and resolve of farmers with weathered hands, mothers clutching their children, shopkeepers who'd known Elijah since he was a boy. He stood at the front, Pastor Green at his side, and told his story, not just of the open house or the warrant, but of what it meant to be hounded by power, to fight for what was right. The room thrummed with quiet fury, with solidarity. Hensley thought he could break Elijah with a badge and a sneer, but he'd underestimated the strength of roots sunk deep in trust and truth. Whatever came next, Elijah wouldn't face it alone. In the dimly lit community hall, Miss Thelma occupied her spot in the front row, her arms folded tightly across her chest, a storm brewing in her piercing gaze. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of the gathered crowd, their murmurs filling the air with a restless energy. Pastor Green stepped to the podium, his presence steady and calm, and opened the meeting with a prayer, his voice a soothing balm over the tension. Then he turned to the sea of faces before him, his tone firm yet laced with urgency. We've gathered here tonight because one of our own, Elijah Carter, is under siege and unjust, relentless attack. This man has poured his sweat into this land, provided for his wife and children, and lifted this community with every ounce of his strength. Yet now, he's being hounded, harassed, and branded a criminal without cause. We can and will not let this stand. The room exploded with applause, shouts of agreement ricocheting off the walls, a collective roar of defiance. Elijah rose from his seat, his broad shoulders squared, and stepped into the flickering light of the hall. In his weathered hands, he clutched a crumpled piece of papero Warrant Officer Warren Hensley had thrust upon him, claiming it gave him dominion over Elijah's hard-earned property. I let him search, Elijah said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. He tore through my barn, my fields, my home, found nothing. But that won't stop him. He'll be back. This isn't about truth for Hensley, it's about power. And if we let him break me, he'll come for someone else next. His words hung heavy in the air, a warning wrapped in resolve. Miss Thelma shot to her feet, her voice slicing through the low hum of whispers like a blade. Not on our watch, Elijah. We're with every single one of us. Her fierce eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to disagree. One by one, others stood, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared outrage tales of Hensley's heavy-handed tactics, his sneers and threats, his unshakable bias. This wasn't just Elijah's fight. It was a reckoning for a man whose abuses had festered in the shadows for far too long. The meeting closed with a plan forged in unity, a formal complaint to the county, bolstered by a flood of signatures, a story in the local paper to shine a spotlight on Hensley's tyranny, and a promise that if he dared return to Elijah's farm, the community would rise as one to meet him. As the crowd trickled out into the cool night, Elijah lingered near the door, his chest swelling with a gratitude so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. The road ahead was treacherous, but for the first time, he felt the weight of companionship in the struggle. Later, as he sat on his porch, the rhythmic chirping of crickets wrapping around him like a blanket, his phone buzzed, shattering the stillness. An unknown number flashed on the screen. He hesitated, his thumb hovering, then answered. "Mr. Carter," came a crisp, unfamiliar voice. "This is Sarah Milligan from the sheriff's office. I've heard about what's happening with Officer Hensley. We're digging into it. You're not alone." Elijah's breath caught as he thanked her, hanging up with a spark of hope igniting in his chest. Hensley's reign of unchecked power was beginning to crack, but Elijah knew the man wouldn't surrender without a vicious fight. The real war was only just dawning. The next morning, Elijah was out in his fields, the sun barely cresting the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the rows of crops. The earth was cool and yielding beneath his worn boots, and the steady swing of his hoe carved a meditative rhythm into the silence. For a fleeting moment, peace settled over him, a rare reprieve from the storm. But then came the growl of an engine, low and ominous, rolling up the dirt path. Elijah straightened, his heart thudding against his ribs as he spotted the patrol car. Officer Hensley emerged alone, his boots crunching against the gravel, his face a twisted mask of barely contained fury. The lines etched around his mouth seemed deeper, his eyes darker, as if the weight of his own anger was consuming him. This wasn't a man here to reason, this was a predator cornered and snarling. "Elijah Carter," Hensley barked, storming toward him with a swagger that reeked of desperation. "You think you're smart, huh? Turning the whole damn town against me, calling in the sheriff? You're digging your own grave, boy." Elijah leaned on his hoe, his stance deceptively calm, but his gaze cut like steel. "The only grave being dug here is yours, officer. Harassing me, trying to pin something on me when there's nothing to find, that's not just wrong. It's against the law you swore to uphold." Hensley's hands twitched at his sides, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to keep his composure. "You don't know who you're messing with, Carter," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "A few signatures and some gossip in the paper won't stop me. You've got no idea what's coming." Elijah stepped closer, his voice low and unyielding. "I'm not here to stop you, Hensley. I'm here to make you answer for what you've done. You think that badge lets you lord over me, over all of US, but it's slipping. The town sees you now, and they won't let you trample us anymore." For a heartbeat, it seemed Hensley might snap as face flushed crimson. His jaw locked so tight the veins in his neck pulsed. But then a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes, a crack in his armor. He took a step back, his bravado faltering. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice a venomous promise. "People like you don't win." Elijah tilted his head, his expression unshaken. "People like Mahonist men who don't bow to bullies. We don't just win, Hensley. We outlast. And that terrifies you, doesn't it?" Before Hensley could retort, another vehicle rumbled up the path, a sheriff's office SUV. Sarah Milligan stepped out, her posture rigid with authority. Flanked by a deputy whose stern face brooked no nonsense, the air shifted, heavy with consequence. "Officer Hensley," Sarah called, her voice sharp and commanding. "We've got multiple complaints about your behavior. You're coming with us for a talk now." Hensley froze, his swagger dissolving into a stammer. "I was just doing my job," he protested, but the confidence had bled out of him, leaving only a hollow shell. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Terrorizing a farmer on his own land isn't your job. You've crossed a line, and it's time we looked into everything you've done." Elijah stood silent, watching as Hensley's world unraveled. The officer cast a final, venomous glare his way, but with no allies to shield him. He had no choice. He climbed into his car and followed Sarah's vehicle down the road, the dust swirling in their wake. Alone again in the field, Elijah felt the sun's warmth seep into his skin, the knot in his chest loosening with every breath. The battle wasn't finished, but this victory sang in his veins. He turned back to his crops, the rich soil a testament to the endurance that had sustained his family for generations. He wasn't just a farmer, was a beacon, a living lesson in standing firm against tyranny. In the days that followed, the town hummed with the aftermath. Word of the showdown spread like wildfire, fanned by the local paper's bold headline and the murmurs of neighbors who'd long tired of Hensley's reign. The sheriff's office launched a full investigation, and Hensley was sidelined, his badge stripped of its menace for now. Elijah, meanwhile, became an unexpected pillar. Folks from every walk of life stopped by his farm, some with casseroles, others with offers to help in the fields, and a few with quiet words of thanks for his courage. One afternoon, as Elijah rested on his porch, Pastor Green ambled up, a basket of warm biscuits in one hand and a newspaper in the other. "Front page, Elijah," he said with a grin, passing it over. The headline blazed, "Local farmer stands tall against harassment, community unites." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't do it for the spotlight, Pastor. I just wanted to work my land in peace." The older man settled beside him, his eyes warm. "You'll get that peace, son, but what you've done goes beyond you. You've shown us what it means to fight with heart, and you've reminded us how strong we are together." Elijah gazed out at his fields, the crops swaying in the breeze like a quiet hymn. "My granddaddy always said the land teaches you life's lessons. Plant the seeds, tend them well, and trust they'll grow." I guess they have. Weeks later, the sheriff's probe concluded, laying bare Hensley's pattern of abuse, and not just against Elijah, but others too. The officer was cast out, his authority extinguished, and the town vowed to keep a sharper eye on those who wielded power. For Elijah, life slipped back into its familiar cadence. Fields called, the seasons turned, and the work filled his days. Yet something had shifted. Neighbors waved with newfound warmth. Market conversations stretched longer, and kids flocked to the farm to learn the ways of the soil. One evening, as he walked the field's edge, Miss Thelma appeared at the fence. Her sharp eyes softened with pride. "You did good, Elijah," she said, her voice rich with approval. "Not just for you, for all of us." He tipped his hat, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just did what needed doing." As the sun dipped low, bathing the sky in shades of amber and violet, Elijah stood still. the hum of insects and rustling leaves wrapping him in quiet triumph. He'd faced down injustice and held his ground not just for himself, but for the legacy of resilience he carried and the community he cherished. Like the seeds he sowed each spring, his stand had blossomed into something vast, a living testament that even in the face of oppression, truth and unity could take root and thrive. The land had taught him that lesson long ago, and now it was teaching the world. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a gift, it was a harvest, reaped from the courage to confront power and the strength to endure its consequences.